What does it take for a single nation to rule over continents, seas, and peoples across the globe, all at once? At its height, the Spanish Empire was the largest the world had ever seen. It stretched from the silver mines of the Andes to the spice ports of Manila, from the cities of Mexico to the coasts of North Africa, and from the heart of Europe to distant Pacific islands. For more than 300 years, Spain governed vast territories on which the sun, quite literally, never set. This is not just a story of conquests and crowns. It is the story of how a collection of Iberian kingdoms became a unified monarchy, and then projected that power outward to shape the modern world. It's the story of explorers and emperors, of colonized societies and resistance, of global trade routes and cultural exchange. And it's the story of how one empire rose, reigned, and eventually fell, leaving behind a complex legacy that still echoes today. Today, we'll trace the Spanish Empire from its medieval foundations to its final collapse at the dawn of the 20th century. We'll follow the human decisions, ambitions, conflicts, and ideas that built and unmade a global empire. This is the entire story of the Spanish Empire. Let's begin. The story of the Spanish Empire begins long before the conquest of the Americas, before the galleons sailed to Manila or the silver flowed from Potosi. It starts on the Iberian Peninsula in a time when Spain did not yet exist. Instead, the land was a patchwork of Christian and Muslim kingdoms locked in centuries of war, diplomacy, and shifting alliances. Understanding how two of those Christian kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, rose to power is essential to understanding how the Spanish Empire came to be. For more than 700 years, the Iberian Peninsula was divided between Muslim-ruled Al-Andalus in the south and various Christian kingdoms in the north. This division began in the early 8th century, when Muslim armies from North Africa crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and swiftly conquered most of the peninsula. Over the following centuries, Christian forces began a gradual military and religious campaign to reclaim territory, a process known as the Reconquista. The Christian push southward was not a united effort, but rather a series of independent and sometimes competing campaigns by different kingdoms. Asturias, Leon, Navarre, Castile, and Aragon among them. Of these, Castile and Aragon would become the most powerful and influential. Castile, originally a frontier county of Leon, gained independence in the 11th century and expanded aggressively. Its name, meaning land of castles, reflected its military character. Castile grew by conquering Muslim lands to the south and absorbing neighboring Christian territories. By the 13th century, under King Ferdinand III, Castile had taken control of key cities such as Córdoba, Seville, and Jaén, pushing the borders of Christian Iberia deep into the south. Meanwhile, the crown of Aragon was taking shape in the east. It began as a small mountain kingdom, but through dynastic union with the county of Barcelona in the 12th century, it became a Mediterranean power. Aragon expanded not only southward into Muslim territory, but also outward across the sea. It gained control of the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, Sicily, and parts of southern Italy. The Aragonese monarchs focused heavily on trade, diplomacy, and naval strength, developing a more cosmopolitan and commercial culture than Castile. By the late 15th century, both kingdoms had become dominant forces in Iberian politics, but they remained separate with different laws, institutions, and customs. That began to change in the year 1469, when Prince Ferdinand of Aragon married Princess Isabella of Castile. This dynastic marriage did not immediately unify Spain into a single country, but it created a powerful political alliance between the two crowns. Ferdinand and Isabella ruled jointly, though each retained control over their own territories. Their partnership was marked by strong coordination, mutual ambition, and a shared vision for religious and political consolidation. Together, they embarked on a project that would fundamentally reshape Iberia and eventually launch a global empire. One of their first major moves was to complete the Reconquista. At the time of their marriage, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain was the Emirate of Granada, a small but wealthy kingdom in the south. Ferdinand and Isabella launched a campaign to conquer it, and after a decade of war, the city of Granada surrendered in January of 1492. This victory ended Muslim rule in Iberia and brought the entire peninsula under Christian control for the first time in nearly 8 centuries. The conquest of Granada was not just a military success, it was a symbolic triumph. It marked the culmination of the Reconquista and solidified Ferdinand and Isabella's reputation as Catholic monarchs, a title officially granted to them by the Pope. This religious identity would become central to the emerging Spanish state and to the ideology of empire that followed. In the same year as the fall of Granada, the monarchs made 2 more decisions that would shape the future of Spain. First, they issued the Alhambra Decree, expelling Spain's Jewish population unless they converted to Christianity. This act of religious intolerance was intended to enforce Catholic orthodoxy, but it also disrupted Spain's economy and intellectual life, as many Jews had been influential in finance, medicine, and scholarship. Second, they agreed to sponsor an ambitious sea voyage proposed by an Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus. Columbus had promised to reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean. Though skeptical, the monarchs provided him with ships and resources. In October of 1492, Columbus landed not in Asia but in the Caribbean, marking the beginning of Spain's overseas empire. These events, military conquest, religious unification, and overseas exploration, were not accidental. They reflected the strategic priorities of the Catholic monarchs to centralize royal power, enforce religious conformity, and expand Spain's influence beyond Europe. The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella created a dynastic and political foundation strong enough to support these ambitions. But their union also laid bare the complexities of early Spain. While they ruled together, Castile and Aragon remained legally and administratively separate. Castile had a larger population and more wealth from its conquests, and its institutions would later dominate the structure of the empire. Aragon retained its own laws and customs, particularly in its overseas holdings in the Mediterranean. This dual legacy would echo throughout Spanish imperial history. Ferdinand and Isabella also began building the institutions of centralized monarchy. They strengthened royal courts, reduced the power of unruly nobles, and formed alliances with towns and cities. They created the Santa Hermandad, a kind of national police force, and worked closely with the Catholic Church to align religious authority with royal interests. One of their most enduring tools of control was the Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478. Though technically under church authority, it operated with royal support and targeted converts from Judaism and Islam who were suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. Over time, the Inquisition expanded its reach and became a feared instrument of religious and political conformity. By the time of Isabella's death in 1504 and Ferdinand's in 1516, they had transformed the Iberian Peninsula. They had ended centuries of religious and political fragmentation, forged a new kind of monarchy, and launched Spain onto the global stage. The foundations were now set. The Spanish state was stronger, more centralized, and ideologically aligned with Catholic expansion. Its ambitions had already crossed the ocean. What began as a marriage between 2 crowns was becoming something more: the birth of a new empire. The year 1492 is often remembered for one event above all others: Christopher Columbus's first voyage across the Atlantic. But in the history of Spain, that year was remarkable for more than just a single journey. It marked a watershed moment when the Spanish crown turned decisively toward empire, militarily, religiously, and globally. Within the span of 12 months, Spain completed the centuries-long Reconquista, expelled its Jewish population, and launched the first expedition that would connect Europe to the Americas. These events were not isolated. They were deeply connected, and together, they reveal how a newly unified Spain was preparing to assert itself on the world stage. At the beginning of 1492, the Emirate of Granada still existed as the last remnant of Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula. Though reduced in territory and influence, Granada had endured for over 2.5 centuries. Its existence symbolized both the persistence of Islamic culture in Spain and the incomplete nature of the Christian Reconquista. For Ferdinand and Isabella, the conquest of Granada was both a political and religious imperative. They wanted to complete the long campaign of Christian recovery and remove the last visible sign of Muslim sovereignty in Iberia. The siege of Granada had begun in 1482, and after 10 years of intermittent warfare, the city finally capitulated. On January 2, 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella entered Granada in a ceremonial display of Christian triumph. The Muslim ruler Boabdil, also known as Muhammad XII, surrendered the keys to the Alhambra Palace and went into exile. According to some accounts, he wept as he looked back on the city he had lost. His mother is said to have told him, "You weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." While apocryphal, the quote captures the emotion of that moment, the end of an era for Al-Andalus and the beginning of a new phase for Spain. The conquest of Granada had military importance, but it also carried deep symbolic weight. It allowed Ferdinand and Isabella to present themselves as the champions of Catholicism. Soon after, Pope Alexander VI conferred upon them the title Catholic monarchs, reinforcing the union between the Spanish crown and the Church. This ideological alliance would shape Spain's approach to both domestic governance and overseas expansion. Barely 3 months after the fall of Granada, the monarchs issued one of the most consequential decrees in Spanish history, the Alhambra Decree, also known as the Edict of Expulsion. Signed in March of 1492, it gave Jews in Castile and Aragon 4 months to convert to Christianity or leave the country. Many Spanish Jews had lived in Iberia for centuries, contributing to scholarship, finance, trade, and medicine. Their sudden removal caused both human suffering and economic disruption. Some converted and remained, becoming known as conversos. Others fled to Portugal, North Africa, or the Ottoman Empire, which welcomed them. The reasons for the expulsion were complex. Religious zeal played a central role, especially the desire to purify Christian Spain from what the monarchy saw as heretical influences. Political motives were also at work. Ferdinand and Isabella wanted to consolidate authority and eliminate any perceived threat to religious unity. The decision had long-term consequences, including the rise of the Spanish Inquisition as a tool for investigating the sincerity of conversions. It also set a precedent for how the Spanish Empire would later treat religious minorities in its overseas territories. While the Jewish expulsion and the conquest of Granada marked the closing of one chapter, another was just beginning. That same spring, Christopher Columbus was preparing for a voyage that, if successful, would alter the course of history. Columbus was not Spanish by birth. He was a Genoese sailor who had spent years trying to secure funding for his plan to reach Asia by sailing west. He had approached several courts in Europe, including Portugal, without success. But after persistent lobbying, he gained an audience with the Catholic monarchs. Several factors likely influenced their decision to fund his journey. With the Reconquista completed, Spain had the military capacity and financial surplus to consider new ventures. They were also eager to compete with Portugal, which had already established trade routes along the African coast and toward the Indian Ocean. Columbus promised something even more ambitious: a direct route to the wealth of Asia that bypassed Muslim-controlled land routes. For the monarchs, it was a gamble worth taking. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail from the port of Palos with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. After a stop in the Canary Islands, the fleet crossed the Atlantic and, on October 12th, made landfall on an island in the Bahamas. Columbus believed he had reached islands near Asia, but he had, in fact, encountered lands unknown to Europeans. He called the inhabitants Indians, assuming they were subjects of the East Indies. In reality, he had arrived in a world that would soon be transformed by European colonization. Columbus went on to explore parts of Cuba and Hispaniola, claiming them for Spain and leaving behind a small settlement. When he returned to Spain in early 1493, he brought with him exotic goods, stories of vast lands, and several indigenous captives. The Spanish crown greeted his return with enthusiasm. Although they soon realized he had not reached Asia, the implications were enormous. The discovery of lands rich in resources and seemingly available for Christian rule offered new possibilities for wealth, prestige, and religious expansion. It is important to recognize that Columbus's voyage was not just a moment of discovery. It was also the beginning of conquest, colonization, and conflict. In later voyages, Columbus and other explorers would establish permanent colonies, impose Spanish rule, and initiate violent encounters with indigenous populations. But in the context of 1492, the emphasis in Spain was on opportunity and divine favor. Many saw the success of the voyage as a sign that God had chosen Spain for a special role in global history. Back in Europe, Spain moved quickly to secure its claims. In 1493, Ferdinand and Isabella sought papal endorsement for their rights over the newly discovered lands. The result was a series of papal bulls that granted Spain dominion over territories west of a certain meridian. This led to tensions with Portugal, which had its own imperial ambitions. In 1494, the two kingdoms signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, agreeing to divide the non-European world between them. Spain would have rights to lands west of a line drawn in the Atlantic, Portugal to the east. Though based on limited geographic knowledge, this treaty helped avoid immediate conflict and gave Spain legal justification for its imperial expansion. The year 1492, then, was not just the backdrop for Columbus's voyage. It was a turning point in Spanish history. In the span of 12 months, the Catholic monarchs completed the centuries-long Reconquista, enforced religious conformity through expulsion, and opened a gateway to overseas empire. These events were not disconnected. Each reflected the same underlying goals: to consolidate power, enforce religious unity, and extend Spanish influence beyond traditional boundaries. The foundations laid in this year would shape every aspect of Spanish imperial policy in the decades to come. From the conversion of indigenous peoples to the extraction of mineral wealth, the themes of faith, authority, and expansion would guide Spain's global actions. And as the 16th century began, Spanish ambitions moved steadily westward toward the great empires of the Americas. In the wake of Columbus's first voyage, Spain moved quickly to establish a presence in the Caribbean. Though the explorer had not found the riches of Asia, he had opened access to an entirely new world of possibilities: fertile lands, unfamiliar peoples, and strategic harbors. What began as a maritime expedition of exploration rapidly evolved into conquest and colonization. The islands of the Caribbean became Spain's first overseas colonies, serving as test cases for the systems, practices, and hierarchies that would later define its vast empire. Columbus returned to the Americas in the year 1493 with a much larger fleet than before, 17 ships and over 1,000 men. This second voyage was not a voyage of discovery, but of settlement. Among the passengers were soldiers, priests, administrators, and settlers, individuals tasked with building a Spanish presence in the region. Their goal was not simply to explore, but to control and extract value from the newly claimed territories. The main focus was the island of Hispaniola, home to the Taino people, whose population at the time may have been in the hundreds of thousands. The Spanish established a colony and began constructing the town of La Isabela on the northern coast, named in honor of Queen Isabella. However, the early settlement was plagued by disease, poor planning, and food shortages. The colonists struggled to adapt to the unfamiliar environment, and relations with the local Taino quickly deteriorated. Columbus's leadership came under criticism from within his own ranks. His efforts to govern and maintain order were marked by harsh policies and inconsistent authority. His treatment of both the Taino and the Spanish colonists drew concern from the crown. By the end of the decade, Columbus had been removed from his position as governor, and royal officials were sent to investigate his administration. Despite these early difficulties, the Spanish did not abandon their ambitions in the Caribbean. They continued to send expeditions and settlers, gradually learning how to establish firmer control over the islands. The colony on Hispaniola survived and expanded, and Spanish explorers began moving outward to other nearby islands. By the early years of the 16th century, the Spanish had set their sights on Cuba. In the year 1511, the conquest of the island was led by Diego Velázquez, who had served under Columbus. The campaign met with pockets of resistance from the indigenous populations, but the Spanish employed both military force and negotiated alliances to subdue the territory. Once established as governor, Velázquez founded several settlements, including Havana, which would later become a critical port for the empire. Cuba's fertile soil and strategic location made it an attractive center for agriculture and trade. The island's economy quickly oriented around the encomienda system, in which Spanish settlers were granted control over indigenous labor in exchange for promises to protect and Christianize the local population. In practice, the system led to severe exploitation. Indigenous communities were subjected to forced labor in mines, plantations, and construction projects. The harsh conditions, along with disease and social disruption, led to catastrophic population decline. Puerto Rico followed a similar pattern. First claimed by Juan Ponce de León in 1511, it was quickly colonized and incorporated into the Spanish network. Like Cuba and Hispaniola, Puerto Rico experienced rapid depopulation due to disease, labor demands, and violence. Spanish rule was established through a combination of fort building, missionary activity, and military patrols. These early conquests reveal several key patterns in Spain's colonial approach. First, the Spanish crown delegated authority to trusted individuals, often those with ties to earlier expeditions, who acted as governors, administrators, and military commanders. These men had considerable autonomy, but were still expected to act in the name of the crown and the Catholic Church. Second, the Spanish relied heavily on systems of tribute and forced labor to make the colonies economically viable. The encomienda system was central to this model, as it allowed settlers to extract labor while justifying their actions through religious language. Third, the Spanish began to integrate missionary efforts into their colonization strategy. Orders such as the Franciscans and Dominicans arrived in the Caribbean to convert indigenous populations to Christianity. Missionaries often learned local languages and engaged in education, but their presence also reinforced colonial control and cultural assimilation. Some, such as Bartolomé de las Casas, would later become critics of Spanish abuse, but in the early years, missionary work generally went hand in hand with colonization. The human cost of these conquests was enormous. Within just a few decades of Spanish arrival, the indigenous population of the Caribbean had been reduced dramatically. Epidemics of smallpox, influenza, and measles, diseases to which the local people had no immunity, spread rapidly and with devastating effect. Combined with forced labor, malnutrition, and displacement, the demographic collapse was swift and severe. Faced with a dwindling labor force, Spanish colonists began looking for alternatives. This would later lead to the introduction of enslaved Africans into the Caribbean colonies, a development that would have long-lasting implications for the social and economic structure of the empire. Although African slavery would not become widespread in the Caribbean until later in the 16th century, the roots of this system were already being laid in these early years. As the Caribbean colonies stabilized, they also became the springboard for further expansion. The islands offered logistical bases, experienced personnel, and strategic knowledge that could be applied to new ventures. From these positions, Spanish expeditions began probing the mainland coasts of Central and South America. They collected intelligence, mapped harbors, and assessed the political landscape. Whispers of wealthy empires inland, especially stories of the Aztecs and the Incas, began circulating among Spanish officials and adventurers. One of the most important figures to emerge from this environment was Hernán Cortés, who had served under Velázquez in Cuba. By the year 1519, he would lead an expedition to the Mexican mainland that would fundamentally change the course of the empire. But his story, and the stories of those who followed him, were only possible because of the earlier experiences in the Caribbean. The conquest and colonization of the Caribbean was not a mere prelude. It was a formative chapter in Spain's imperial history. It established key practices, economic exploitation, religious conversion, and military control, that would be repeated on a larger scale in the Americas. It also taught Spain's leaders how to manage distant colonies, deal with indigenous resistance, and balance the demands of settlers, the church, and the crown. Most importantly, it revealed the possibilities and the limits of early empire. The Caribbean offered wealth, but not the vast treasures the Spanish had hoped to find. Still, the settlements endured, and from their harbors, ships would soon sail westward again, this time toward powerful empires on the mainland. By the second decade of the 16th century, Spanish colonists in the Caribbean were growing restless. The islands had been settled, but the anticipated wealth had not materialized on the scale they had hoped. Rumors of a vast and wealthy empire on the mainland, one with gold, cities, and organized armies, circulated widely among Spanish officials and adventurers. These rumors were enough to attract the attention of an ambitious man living in Cuba, Hernán Cortés. Hernán Cortés was born in Medellín, in the region of Extremadura, Spain, in the year 1485. Like many young men of his generation, he was drawn to the opportunities offered by Spain's growing overseas empire. He arrived in Hispaniola in the early years of Spanish colonization and later joined the conquest of Cuba under Diego Velázquez. Cortés proved himself capable, gaining land, status, and wealth, but his ambition soon outgrew the island. When word reached Cuba of powerful kingdoms on the mainland, Cortés began to plan an expedition of his own. In the year 1519, without full authorization from Governor Velázquez, Cortés assembled a fleet of 11 ships and a force of roughly 600 men. He also brought along horses, firearms, and several cannons, technologies unfamiliar to the indigenous peoples of the mainland. He sailed westward from Cuba and landed on the coast of what is now Mexico, near the present-day city of Veracruz. From the very beginning, Cortés understood that conquest would require more than military force. It would require diplomacy, manipulation, and alliances. Soon after landing, he made contact with local peoples who had long been under the domination of the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs, known to themselves as the Mexica, ruled over a powerful and expansive empire centered in the city of Tenochtitlan. Their power extended through a network of tribute and military control, and many subject peoples resented their rule. Cortés exploited this discontent. He negotiated with local leaders and forged alliances with indigenous groups, including the Totonacs and later the Tlaxcalans, who became some of his most loyal and effective allies. This strategy gave him access to thousands of additional warriors and valuable knowledge of the land, languages, and political dynamics. A crucial figure during this phase of the expedition was a woman named Malintzin, also known as La Malinche. She was a Nahua noblewoman who had been given to the Spanish as a slave and quickly became Cortés's interpreter, advisor, and intermediary. Her fluency in multiple indigenous languages allowed her to communicate between the Spanish and various Mesoamerican groups. Though often depicted in simplistic terms, either as a traitor or a victim, her role was far more complex. She was central to Cortés's success in diplomacy and negotiation. As the Spanish advanced inland, they encountered increasing signs of the Aztec Empire's wealth and sophistication. They saw marketplaces, temples, aqueducts, and roads. Tenochtitlan itself, located on a lake and connected by causeways, was a marvel. When Cortés finally entered the city in November of 1519, he was astonished by its size and organization. Some Spanish accounts compared it favorably to cities in Europe. At this point, the Aztec Emperor Montezuma II faced a difficult choice. He was aware of the Spanish arrival and had received reports of their strange appearance, weapons, and animals. Some later sources suggest he was unsure whether the Spanish were gods or men, though modern historians question the accuracy of that interpretation. What is clear is that Montezuma chose not to resist their entry into the city. He welcomed Cortés and his men, housed them, and offered tribute, perhaps hoping to keep the peace or assess the threat. This uneasy coexistence did not last. Cortés, sensing both opportunity and danger, took Montezuma hostage and attempted to rule through him. For several months, the Spanish remained in the city, using Montezuma as a puppet. Tensions grew between the Spanish and the Mexica, especially as more troops arrived and Spanish demands intensified. In the spring of 1520, Cortés temporarily left the city to confront a rival Spanish expedition sent by Governor Velázquez to arrest him. Cortés defeated the rival force and persuaded many of its soldiers to join him. But during his absence, Spanish soldiers remaining in Tenochtitlan committed a massacre during a religious festival, killing unarmed worshippers. This act enraged the population and triggered a full-scale uprising. When Cortés returned, the city was in open revolt. The Spanish attempted to flee during the night in what became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Many Spaniards and their indigenous allies were killed as they tried to escape the city. It was a devastating setback. But Cortés regrouped. Over the next year, he reorganized his forces, secured more indigenous allies, and laid siege to Tenochtitlan. The siege lasted for months and involved fierce fighting, famine, and disease. Eventually, the city fell in August of 1521. Montezuma had died under uncertain circumstances, and his successors were unable to repel the Spanish advance. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the collapse of the Aztec Empire and the establishment of Spanish rule over central Mexico. Cortés renamed the city Mexico City and began building a new colonial capital atop the ruins. He sent detailed reports and gifts of gold back to Spain, which fueled further interest in imperial expansion. The conquest of Mexico had profound consequences. It revealed the potential wealth of the Americas, especially in gold and silver, and demonstrated that small numbers of Europeans, with the help of indigenous allies and advanced weaponry, could topple large and complex empires. It also introduced new patterns of governance. Cortés established Spanish institutions, including municipal councils and religious orders, to oversee the new colony. In the years that followed, Spanish settlers arrived in increasing numbers. The Catholic Church began missionary work, converting thousands of indigenous people and building churches on former temple sites. Spanish laws and customs were imposed, and the indigenous population faced massive disruption, socially, economically, and demographically. Disease continued to take a heavy toll, and the encomienda system was extended to central Mexico, bringing new forms of labor exploitation. Hernán Cortés was eventually granted the title of Marqués del Valle de Oaxaca and accumulated vast landholdings. However, his authority was gradually curtailed by the crown, which sent royal officials to assert control over the new colony. The Spanish monarchy recognized that the riches of Mexico were too important to be left in the hands of any one man. The conquest of the Aztec Empire was not the work of Cortés alone. It was a joint effort involving thousands of indigenous allies, logistical support from the Caribbean, and the backing of the Spanish crown. Still, his boldness and strategic vision made him one of the most significant figures in the history of the Spanish Empire. From this point forward, New Spain, centered in Mexico, became a cornerstone of Spain's global empire. The conquest of the Aztecs opened the door to further campaigns throughout the Americas and reshaped the geopolitical and cultural landscape of the Western Hemisphere. While the Spanish were consolidating their control over central Mexico, explorers and fortune seekers looked further south. Tales of another rich and powerful empire, one that rivaled the Aztecs in size and wealth, began circulating throughout New Spain and Spain itself. This empire, nestled in the high Andes of South America, was the Inca Empire. Its cities, infrastructure, and resources captivated the imagination of Spanish adventurers. Among them was Francisco Pizarro, a man of humble origins but relentless ambition, who would lead one of the most audacious and consequential expeditions in the history of the Spanish Empire. Francisco Pizarro was born in the town of Trujillo in western Spain around the year 1474. He was the illegitimate son of an infantry officer and received little formal education. Like many young men with few prospects at home, he looked to the New World for opportunity. He participated in several early expeditions in the Caribbean and joined Vasco Núñez de Balboa's crossing of the Isthmus of Panama in the year 1513, where he first glimpsed the Pacific Ocean and heard rumors of wealthy civilizations to the south. These rumors gained substance over time. Indigenous peoples spoke of a kingdom rich in gold and silver, where roads stretched for miles and the rulers commanded legions of disciplined warriors. The Spanish called this land Peru, though its own people knew it as Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. It was the heart of the Inca Empire, with its capital at Cusco and its reach extending across the Andean highlands and coastal valleys. In the year 1524, Pizarro, along with fellow explorers Diego de Almagro and the priest Hernando de Luque, formed a partnership to explore the lands south of Panama. Their first two expeditions were difficult and yielded little, plagued by storms, shortages, and resistance from indigenous groups. But Pizarro remained convinced that great wealth lay further down the coast. During their second expedition, Pizarro made contact with coastal communities who described the Inca Empire in greater detail. He obtained small samples of gold and silver, enough to convince both himself and the Spanish authorities that a serious campaign was justified. Returning to Spain in 1528, Pizarro secured royal approval from Emperor Charles V, who granted him the right to conquer and govern the lands he discovered. In 1530, Pizarro launched his third and final expedition. He landed on the northern coast of modern-day Peru and established a base at San Miguel. From there, he began moving inland, accompanied by fewer than 200 Spanish soldiers. Though vastly outnumbered, the Spanish brought with them horses, steel weapons, and gunpowder, technologies unfamiliar to the Andean world. Just as importantly, they arrived during a moment of political crisis. At the time, the Inca Empire was reeling from a recent civil war. The Emperor Huayna Capac had died in a smallpox outbreak, a disease introduced by Europeans that had reached South America ahead of the conquistadors. His death triggered a succession struggle between his sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa. After years of brutal conflict, Atahualpa emerged victorious, but the empire was weakened and divided. Pizarro learned of this situation and saw an opportunity. In 1532, he requested a meeting with Atahualpa, who was camped near the town of Cajamarca with thousands of his troops. Despite his military advantage, Atahualpa agreed to meet the Spanish, confident in his own authority. He entered the town with a small entourage, unarmed and curious about these foreign visitors. What happened next was both calculated and devastating. The Spanish ambushed Atahualpa, capturing him and massacring many of his attendants. The emperor was taken prisoner, and Pizarro immediately asserted that the Spanish now held authority over the empire. This single event, seizing the Inca ruler, threw the entire empire into confusion. In Inca political culture, the person of the emperor was sacred and central to governance. With Atahualpa in Spanish hands, the leadership structure collapsed. Atahualpa, hoping to secure his release, offered the Spanish an enormous ransom, a room filled with gold and twice over with silver. The treasure was gathered from across the empire and delivered over several months, making it one of the largest ransom payments in recorded history. But once it was collected, the Spanish killed Atahualpa anyway, strangling him after a staged trial on charges of rebellion, idolatry, and fratricide. The execution shocked the Andean world. Though the Spanish installed a puppet ruler, Manco Inca Yupanqui, resistance flared across the empire. Pizarro and his forces marched on Cusco in 1533 and took the capital. They looted temples, palaces, and storehouses, seizing immense wealth and laying the groundwork for Spanish administration. From the beginning, Spanish rule in Peru was marked by conflict, rivalry, and instability. Pizarro and Almagro, once allies, fell into dispute over the division of spoils and territory. Almagro attempted to seize Cusco, claiming it fell within his jurisdiction. The two factions fought openly, and in 1538, Pizarro's forces killed Almagro. 3 years later, Almagro's supporters assassinated Pizarro in Lima, the new city he had founded on the Pacific coast. Despite this internal strife, Spain tightened its grip on Peru. The establishment of the Viceroyalty of Peru in 1542 formalized Spanish authority, placing the region under the control of a royal governor who reported directly to the crown. Catholic missionaries arrived in large numbers, building churches and converting the indigenous population. Spanish law and language spread throughout the highlands and coastal plains. The economic core of the colony became the silver mines of Potosi, located in present-day Bolivia. Discovered in 1545, these mines produced unprecedented amounts of silver, which were shipped to Spain and used to finance imperial ambitions across Europe. Indigenous labor, conscripted through the mita system, a practice inherited and modified from Inca labor traditions, was essential to the operation of the mines. Conditions were harsh, and mortality rates were high. The conquest of Peru, like that of Mexico, had global consequences. It enriched the Spanish treasury, expanded the reach of the Catholic Church, and introduced European power into the heart of the Andes. It also devastated indigenous societies through disease, warfare, forced labor, and cultural disruption. The fall of the Inca Empire was not the end of resistance. Uprisings and rebellions would continue for decades, but it marked the beginning of a new colonial order. Pizarro's legacy remains controversial. He is remembered by some as a brilliant military strategist and by others as a ruthless opportunist. In Peru, his statue once stood in the capital he founded, though it has since been removed as part of a broader reckoning with colonial history. The Spanish conquest of Peru completed the transformation of Spain from a regional European power to a global empire. With vast new territories under its control and streams of precious metals flowing across the Atlantic, Spain was now poised to become the dominant force in Europe and the Americas. By the middle of the 16th century, Spain faced a unique challenge: how to govern an empire that spanned oceans, climates, and cultures. From the highlands of Peru to the plateaus of central Mexico, and from coastal Caribbean islands to distant Pacific ports, the Spanish Empire had grown into an enormous network of territories. Conquest had been achieved by bold individuals, Cortés in Mexico, Pizarro in Peru. But conquest alone was not enough to hold such a vast realm together. Spain needed to govern, to administer justice, to collect taxes, and to enforce religious and political order across the empire. This section traces how the Spanish monarchy built the colonial institutions that allowed it to do exactly that. The need for structured governance was recognized early. Initially, conquistadors ruled with relative autonomy, often acting as both military leaders and political governors. But their rivalries, abuses, and desire for independence raised concerns in Spain. The monarchy understood that unchecked power in the hands of individuals like Hernán Cortés or Francisco Pizarro posed a threat not only to royal authority, but also to the long-term stability of the empire. As a result, the crown took active steps to centralize control. One of the first key steps was the establishment of the Council of the Indies in the year 1524. This royal body, based in Seville and later in Madrid, was responsible for overseeing all Spanish territories in the Americas and, eventually, the Philippines. It was composed of jurists, administrators, and theologians who advised the king and issued laws for the colonies. The council had sweeping powers. It reviewed reports from the colonies, appointed officials, supervised the church's role in the New World, and acted as the highest court of appeals for colonial subjects. However, the Council of the Indies could not directly administer distant territories. To implement its decisions and maintain day-to-day control, Spain established viceroyalties, large territorial units governed by viceroys who represented the monarch. The first and most important of these was the Viceroyalty of New Spain, created in 1535 and centered in Mexico City. It covered not only present-day Mexico but also Central America, the Caribbean, and eventually parts of the southwestern United States and the Philippines. The second major administrative unit was the Viceroyalty of Peru, created in 1542 after the consolidation of Spanish power in South America. Its capital was in Lima, and it controlled the vast Andean region, including modern-day Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and parts of Chile and Argentina. These viceroyalties functioned almost as mini-monarchies. The viceroy held civil, military, and judicial authority, and his word carried the weight of the king's command. Below the viceroys were other officials: governors, captains general, and audiencias. The audiencias were high courts that combined judicial, administrative, and consultative functions. They not only heard legal cases but also advised viceroys and governors on policy matters. In theory, this layered system was meant to provide checks and balances. In practice, it often led to bureaucratic complexity and competing jurisdictions. To ensure loyalty and prevent the rise of local dynasties, most high-ranking colonial officials were peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe, rather than criollos, who were Spaniards born in the Americas. This policy reinforced the social hierarchy and tied the colonial elite more closely to the crown. However, it also created lasting tensions between peninsulares and criollos that would resurface in later centuries. One of the most significant innovations of Spanish colonial administration was the legal framework known as the Laws of the Indies. These were a vast collection of royal decrees, legal codes, and administrative guidelines that regulated virtually every aspect of colonial life. They covered urban planning, indigenous rights, trade regulations, and religious practices. For example, the laws mandated that new towns follow a specific grid pattern, with a central plaza, church, and government buildings, a model still visible in many Latin American cities today. The Spanish also took a particular interest in the governance of indigenous populations. The crown claimed a duty to protect indigenous peoples as new subjects of the king. As part of this policy, indigenous communities were organized into reducciones, or settlements where they could be converted to Christianity, taught Spanish customs, and taxed more efficiently. Each community was assigned a local magistrate, often indigenous, who reported to Spanish officials. In theory, these systems provided a degree of autonomy and protection. In reality, they often became tools for extraction and control. The encomienda system, introduced in the Caribbean and later extended to the mainland, played a central role in organizing labor and tribute. Under this system, Spanish settlers, known as encomenderos, were granted the right to receive labor and tribute from indigenous communities in exchange for providing protection and religious instruction. While it was not technically slavery, the system led to severe abuses and exploitation. Concerns over these abuses reached Spain early on. Clerics such as Bartolomé de las Casas spoke out forcefully against the mistreatment of indigenous people. A former encomendero turned Dominican friar, Las Casas lobbied the crown for reform. His efforts contributed to the passage of the new laws in 1542, which aimed to restrict the encomienda system and protect indigenous rights. The laws forbade the inheritance of encomiendas and ordered their gradual abolition. However, resistance from colonial elites and the distance from Spain meant that enforcement was uneven at best. Alongside secular governance, the Catholic Church played a foundational role in colonial administration. Missionaries were among the first Europeans to enter new territories, and they established missions, schools, and churches. The Church was responsible for the conversion of indigenous peoples, and it operated in close collaboration with colonial authorities. The Inquisition, though less intense in the Americas than in Spain, also extended its reach to monitor heresy, blasphemy, and unorthodox behavior. The Crown granted the Church vast authority through a legal arrangement known as the Patronato Real, or royal patronage. Under this agreement, the king had the power to appoint bishops and control ecclesiastical revenues in the Americas. In return, the Church legitimized Spanish rule and promoted Catholic doctrine. This close alliance helped unify the empire under a common religion and reinforce royal authority. Economically, the Spanish Empire relied on a combination of royal monopolies, local taxes, and transatlantic trade. Silver from the mines of Zacatecas and Potosi was collected, refined, and sent to Spain via tightly controlled convoys known as the flota system. To protect against pirates and rival European powers, the Crown mandated that trade flow through specific ports: Veracruz in New Spain, Cartagena in South America, and Seville in Spain. This system enriched both the monarchy and Spanish merchants, but it also fostered widespread smuggling and corruption. The effectiveness of Spain's colonial administration lay in its ability to impose structure while adapting to local conditions. Spanish officials frequently relied on indigenous elites, interpreters, and customary practices to maintain control. Many pre-Columbian political structures, such as local caciques or curacas, were incorporated into the colonial system. These leaders served as intermediaries between Spanish authorities and indigenous communities, collecting tribute, organizing labor, and facilitating religious conversion. Despite its vastness, the Spanish Empire functioned with remarkable coherence. Royal authority, reinforced by religion, law, and a network of loyal officials, managed to govern territories thousands of miles apart. Yet the system was not without its weaknesses. Communication was slow, corruption was common, and local resistance, both indigenous and Spanish, persisted in many areas. Still, by the late 16th century, Spain had built one of the most sophisticated imperial administrations the world had ever seen. It was a system designed not just to control territory, but to extract wealth, convert souls, and project royal power across oceans. As Spanish ships began crossing the Atlantic regularly during the 16th century, they did more than transport people and treasure. They carried animals, plants, microbes, and ideas between two worlds that had evolved separately for thousands of years. This vast and ongoing transfer of life forms between the Eastern and Western hemispheres is known as the Columbian exchange. Though it was not planned or coordinated, the exchange profoundly reshaped environments, societies, and economies on both sides of the Atlantic. At the same time, it triggered one of the most catastrophic demographic collapses in human history. Before the Spanish arrived in the Americas, the biological worlds of Europe and the Americas had developed in isolation. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had domesticated crops such as maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, and tobacco. They cultivated these with precision, creating agricultural systems suited to local environments. But they lacked certain animals and pathogens that were common in Europe, Asia, and Africa. This ecological separation would have dire consequences. When Europeans arrived, they unknowingly introduced Old World diseases to indigenous populations. These included smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and malaria. Because Native American communities had no previous exposure to these diseases, they had no built-up immunity. The result was devastating. Entire communities were struck down in a matter of weeks. Death often preceded any contact with European forces, as disease spread ahead of explorers and colonists. Historians estimate that in the first century after Columbus's landing, the indigenous population of the Americas declined by as much as 80 to 90% in many regions. This was not due solely to disease. Warfare, forced labor, famine, and social disruption also played a role, but disease was by far the most lethal factor. The demographic collapse was so profound that it transformed the very fabric of indigenous societies, undermining their ability to resist colonization and disrupting centuries of cultural continuity. In Mesoamerica and the Andes, cities that had once supported tens of thousands became ghost towns. Agricultural terraces and canals were abandoned. Rituals, lineages, and oral histories disappeared with the people who held them. In some regions, the trauma was so severe that survivors believed the world itself was ending. Spanish missionaries, witnessing the scale of death, sometimes interpreted it as divine confirmation of the righteousness of Christian conquest. Yet, while disease took an unimaginable toll on indigenous populations, The Columbian exchange was not a one-sided phenomenon. As Spanish colonists settled the Americas, they brought with them a wide range of plants and animals that transformed local ecosystems and food systems. One of the most significant introductions was livestock. Horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats, all absent from the Americas before Spanish contact, became essential to colonial agriculture and transport. Horses, in particular, had a transformative impact on indigenous societies in the Great Plains and other regions. Over time, some indigenous groups, such as the Comanche and Lakota, adopted horse culture with remarkable success, using it to expand their mobility, hunting range, and military power. Cattle and pigs multiplied rapidly in the Americas, often escaping captivity and forming wild herds. These animals altered landscapes by trampling native vegetation and changing soil composition. They also provided new sources of food, leather, and labor for colonists, while disrupting indigenous farming practices. The Spanish also introduced new crops. Wheat, barley, oats, and sugarcane became staples of colonial economies. Sugarcane, in particular, found a favorable climate in the Caribbean and parts of South America. It became one of the most profitable crops in the Spanish Empire, but required intensive labor to cultivate and process. The labor shortage caused by indigenous population decline contributed to the growing importation of enslaved Africans, a process that would expand dramatically in the coming centuries. Conversely, crops native to the Americas spread across the Atlantic and revolutionized diets in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, chili peppers, and cacao became staples around the world. Potatoes, in particular, were adopted widely in Northern and Eastern Europe, where they thrived in poor soils and harsh climates. The increase in calorie availability helped drive population growth in Europe during the early modern period. Tobacco, another American crop, became highly sought after in Europe. Though initially controversial, some clergymen condemned it as a vice. It was soon embraced as both a medicinal herb and a recreational substance. Tobacco plantations became a major source of revenue for Spanish and later European colonies. Alongside plants and animals, the Columbian exchange included the movement of people. Spanish colonists arrived in increasing numbers, bringing their languages, customs, and institutions. African slaves were transported across the Atlantic to labor in mines and plantations. Over time, this mixture of European, indigenous, and African peoples produced complex societies characterized by cultural blending and social stratification. New racial categories emerged in Spanish America to describe this diversity. Terms like mestizo, mixed indigenous and Spanish, mulatto, mixed African and Spanish, and zombo, mixed indigenous and African, reflected the colonial obsession with ancestry and status. A formal caste system developed in many areas, assigning privileges and restrictions based on racial background. Though these categories were fluid in practice, they shaped access to land, education, and office for generations. The Catholic Church played a key role in managing the cultural dimensions of the exchange. Missionaries translated Christian doctrine into indigenous languages, taught European farming techniques, and introduced new festivals and practices. In many cases, indigenous religious symbols and customs were adapted or absorbed into Catholic rituals, resulting in hybrid forms of worship that persist to this day. The exchange of knowledge was not entirely one-directional. Indigenous agricultural practices, especially techniques suited to high altitude or tropical environments, were sometimes adopted by Spanish colonists. Medicinal plants used by indigenous healers gained interest among European doctors and botanists. Still, the power dynamics of colonization meant that European ways of knowing were often privileged over indigenous ones. The ecological effects of the Columbian exchange were far-reaching. In some areas, introduced species became invasive, crowding out native plants and animals. The expansion of sugar and livestock farming led to deforestation and soil erosion. The use of European plows and tools changed the way land was cultivated, often reducing biodiversity. Despite the many changes it introduced, the Columbian exchange was not a single event, but an ongoing process. It continued for centuries, shaping not just agriculture and diet, but also trade, warfare, demography, and identity. It tied the fate of distant continents together in ways that were previously unimaginable. For Spain, the exchange brought both opportunity and challenge. The influx of silver and new crops fueled economic growth, but also inflation and dependency. The crown had to manage increasingly diverse and far-flung territories. The blending of cultures created vibrant new societies, but also required new tools of governance and social control. For indigenous peoples, the exchange was often catastrophic. Population loss, cultural dislocation, and the imposition of foreign systems left deep scars. Yet many indigenous communities survived, adapted, and resisted, maintaining their languages, traditions, and identities into the colonial period and beyond. By the early 16th century, the Spanish crown presided over an expanding empire in the Americas. But at the same time, a parallel and even more complex development was unfolding in Europe. Through a series of dynastic inheritances, the Spanish monarchs became part of the powerful House of Habsburg, one of the most influential royal families in European history. When Charles V ascended the throne, he inherited not just the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, but also a sprawling collection of European territories. His reign marked the point at which Spain truly became the center of a global empire, one that spanned from the Americas to Central Europe, the Netherlands to the Mediterranean, and even into parts of Asia and Africa. Charles V was born in the year 1490 in Ghent, in what is today Belgium. He was the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain on his mother's side, and of Emperor Maximilian of the Holy Roman Empire on his father's side. Through a series of carefully arranged marriages, the Habsburg family had accumulated an astonishing array of territories. When Charles's father, Philip the Handsome, died young, and then his grandfather Ferdinand passed away, Charles found himself the heir to a vast and diverse empire. By the year 1519, Charles had become King of Spain, ruling both Castile and Aragon, along with the Spanish possessions in the Americas, Italy, and North Africa. In that same year, he was elected Holy Roman Emperor, gaining control over the German-speaking states of Central Europe and the Low Countries. The union of these territories under a single ruler was unprecedented and posed both immense opportunities and serious challenges. Charles V's empire was not a centralized state, but a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and colonies. Each had its own laws, institutions, languages, and traditions. Governing such a complex realm required diplomacy, delegation, and constant travel. Charles spent much of his reign on the move, addressing crises in Germany, revolts in Spain, wars in Italy, and threats from the Ottoman Empire. One of the first challenges Charles faced came from within Spain itself. In the early 1520s, the revolt of the Comuneros broke out in Castile. The uprising was driven by resentment toward Charles's foreign advisors, his heavy taxation, and his perceived neglect of Castilian interests. Towns and cities across central Spain rebelled against royal authority. Charles, then still inexperienced, relied on loyal nobles and military forces to suppress the revolt. By 1521, the uprising had been crushed, but it served as an early warning about the fragility of royal authority and the need to respect local customs and power structures. At the same time, Charles found himself confronting a religious and political revolution in the German states. In 1517, Martin Luther had published his 95 Theses, challenging the authority of the Catholic Church and sparking what would become the Protestant Reformation. As Holy Roman Emperor, Charles was expected to defend Catholicism and maintain religious unity. But the empire was a loose confederation of states, and many German princes supported Protestant reforms, either out of conviction or political calculation. Charles convened several imperial diets, formal assemblies of princes and clergy, in an effort to find compromise. At the Diet of Worms in 1521, he declared Luther an outlaw, but the reform movement continued to grow. The resulting religious fragmentation of the empire led to decades of tension, culminating in the Schmalkaldic War between Charles's forces and the Protestant princes. Though Charles won several military victories, he was ultimately unable to restore religious unity. The Peace of Augsburg, signed in 1555, allowed each prince to determine the religion of his own territory, effectively institutionalizing division. In addition to internal challenges, Charles faced powerful external enemies. In the east, the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent was expanding into Central Europe and the Mediterranean. The Ottomans captured Belgrade, besieged Vienna, and gained control of much of Hungary. In the Mediterranean, they threatened Spanish holdings and Christian shipping lanes. Charles responded by strengthening coastal defenses and supporting the Christian fleet, but the Ottoman presence remained a constant threat. In the west, Charles's greatest rival was King Francis I of France. The two monarchs engaged in a series of conflicts known as the Italian Wars, fighting for control of territories in northern Italy and influence over the papacy. These wars were costly and inconclusive, draining resources and straining the empire's finances. Despite these challenges, Charles presided over a period of remarkable imperial expansion. The Spanish conquests in the Americas continued under his reign, with new territories being explored, claimed, and settled. Silver from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas poured into the royal treasury, funding military campaigns and administrative growth. Missionaries extended the reach of the Catholic Church, and Spanish law and language spread across vast areas. Yet, Charles never saw the Americas as merely colonial possessions. He viewed them as part of a Christian commonwealth under his protection. He corresponded regularly with officials in New Spain and Peru, issued laws to govern indigenous relations, and commissioned reports on the state of the colonies. Though his ability to enforce these directives was limited, his interest in imperial governance helped shape Spain's long-term administrative structures. Perhaps more than any other monarch of his time, Charles embodied the idea of a universal empire, one ruled by a Christian prince who defended the faith and upheld order across continents. But the reality of empire proved more complicated. The constant warfare, religious division, and administrative burden took their toll. Charles increasingly withdrew from direct governance, delegating authority to his brother Ferdinand in the Holy Roman Empire and to trusted viceroys and officials in Spain and the Americas. In 1556, exhausted and disillusioned, Charles abdicated. He divided his empire between his brother and his son. Ferdinand became Holy Roman Emperor, while Charles's son Philip inherited Spain, the Netherlands, southern Italy, and the overseas colonies. Charles retired to a monastery in Spain, where he died 2 years later. The reign of Charles V marked a turning point in European and world history. It was the moment when Spain, through the union of dynasties and the force of conquest, emerged as the most powerful state in the Western world. Charles's vision of a unified Christian empire may have proved unattainable, but the institutions and connections forged during his rule laid the foundation for Spanish dominance under his son, Philip II. When Charles V abdicated in the mid-16th century, he passed the Spanish crown to his son, Philip II. With this transition, Spain entered what many historians consider the height of its imperial power. Philip ruled not only the Iberian Peninsula, but also vast colonial territories in the Americas and Asia, the wealthy Low Countries, parts of Italy, and eventually even Portugal and its global possessions. His reign marked the culmination of Spain's rise to global dominance, but it also exposed the challenges of maintaining such an extensive empire. Philip II was born in the year 1527 in Valladolid. Unlike his father, who had spent much of his life traveling between territories and capitals, Philip was more withdrawn and methodical. He preferred to govern from a fixed location and ruled largely from his court at El Escorial, a massive royal palace and monastery complex built outside Madrid. From there, he oversaw an empire where, famously, the sun never set. Philip's rule was shaped by a deep commitment to Catholic orthodoxy, centralization of royal power, and a belief in Spain's divine mission to defend and spread the faith. These goals brought both triumphs and turmoil. Under his leadership, Spain reached the peak of its territorial expansion and influence, but it also became embroiled in prolonged wars, internal revolts, and growing economic pressures. One of Philip's first major undertakings was to solidify control over the Spanish Netherlands, a region inherited from his father that included modern-day Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of the Netherlands. The Low Countries were among the most economically advanced regions in Europe, with thriving cities and prosperous trade. However, they were also increasingly influenced by Protestant ideas, particularly Calvinism. Philip's insistence on enforcing Catholic uniformity and royal authority provoked widespread resistance. In 1566, tensions boiled over into open revolt. What followed was the 80 Years' War, a protracted and brutal conflict between Spanish forces and Dutch rebels. The Spanish army, under commanders like the Duke of Alba, attempted to suppress the rebellion through military force and harsh punishments. The imposition of the Inquisition and the execution of Protestant leaders only intensified resistance. Eventually, the northern provinces declared independence, forming the Dutch Republic, while the southern provinces remained under Spanish control. This division would endure for generations and marked one of the first significant cracks in Spanish imperial unity. While Spain struggled to hold on to the Netherlands, Philip also engaged in conflict with the Ottoman Empire. The Mediterranean had long been a contested zone between Christian and Muslim powers, and Ottoman expansion threatened Spanish possessions in North Africa and the Western Mediterranean. In response, Philip joined forces with other Catholic states to form the Holy League, a naval alliance aimed at halting Ottoman dominance. The most significant outcome of this alliance was the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. In a massive naval engagement off the coast of western Greece, the Holy League fleet decisively defeated the Ottoman navy. The victory was celebrated across Europe as a triumph of Christian unity and Spanish naval strength. Though it did not permanently end Ottoman influence in the Mediterranean, it marked a turning point in the balance of power and solidified Spain's image as the defender of Catholic Europe. Back in the Atlantic, Philip faced another formidable adversary, England. Relations with the English crown had once been cooperative. Philip had even married Queen Mary I of England, a fellow Catholic. But after her death and the accession of Elizabeth I, tensions escalated. Elizabeth supported Protestant rebels in the Netherlands and allowed English privateers to raid Spanish treasure ships returning from the Americas. In response, Philip launched one of the most ambitious military campaigns of his reign, the Spanish Armada. In 1588, he sent a massive fleet toward England with the goal of overthrowing Elizabeth and restoring Catholic rule. However, the operation was plagued by logistical problems, adverse weather, and determined English resistance. The Armada was scattered and ultimately defeated. While the loss did not cripple Spanish naval power entirely, it was a major psychological blow and marked the beginning of England's rise as a maritime challenger. Despite military setbacks, Philip continued to pursue territorial expansion. In 1580, the Portuguese crown became vacant after the death of King Henry of Portugal, without a direct heir. Philip, as the grandson of a Portuguese king through his mother, claimed the throne and was accepted as King Philip I of Portugal. This dynastic union brought Portugal and its vast colonial network, including Brazil, parts of Africa, and territories in Asia, under Spanish rule. For a brief period, the Iberian Peninsula was united under a single monarch, and the combined overseas empire stretched across the globe. The acquisition of Portugal significantly enhanced Spain's geopolitical reach, but it also brought new burdens. Defending and managing such a vast and dispersed empire required enormous resources. The Spanish economy, though enriched by silver from the Americas, began to feel the strain. Inflation surged, and the costs of prolonged warfare drained the royal treasury. Spain declared bankruptcy multiple times during Philip's reign, reflecting the gap between imperial ambition and financial reality. At home, Philip centralized power further by building an extensive bureaucracy. He relied on councils and secretaries to manage different aspects of the empire, from colonial affairs to military planning. While this system provided a degree of administrative stability, it also led to slow decision-making and dependence on the monarch's personal oversight. Philip's meticulous and controlling style meant that even minor decisions could be delayed, sometimes with costly consequences. Religion remained at the heart of Philip's rule. He supported the expansion of the Catholic Church in the Americas and Asia, funding missionary work and enforcing religious conformity through the Inquisition. He also viewed himself as the bulwark against Protestantism in Europe, a role that defined much of his foreign policy. Yet his religious fervor sometimes led him to overreach, committing Spain to conflicts that were as ideological as they were strategic. One of Philip's most lasting legacies was the construction of El Escorial. This enormous complex served as a royal palace, monastery, library, and mausoleum. Built in the austere Herrerian style, it reflected Philip's personal piety and vision of monarchy as both sacred and disciplined. El Escorial became a symbol of Spanish absolutism and imperial ideology, grand, orderly, and devoted to faith. Philip II died in the year 1598 after more than 4 decades on the throne. His reign had seen the Spanish Empire reach its greatest territorial extent and its peak in global influence. He had defended Catholicism across continents, fought powerful rivals, and governed one of the most complex and diverse empires in history. Yet he also left behind a state burdened by debt, military commitments, and growing resistance. The legacy of Philip's rule is one of contrasts. He expanded and defended the Spanish Empire with remarkable energy and devotion, but his rigidity and uncompromising policies sowed the seeds of future challenges. Under his successors, Spain would continue to fight for dominance, but the balance of power in Europe and the wider world was beginning to shift. By the final decades of the 16th century, Spain stood at the apex of its imperial power. Under Philip II, it had expanded across continents, united with Portugal, and claimed guardianship of Catholicism in a time of deep religious fracture in Europe. But Spain's ambitions and responsibilities brought it into direct conflict with emerging powers, most notably Protestant England under Queen Elizabeth I. The rivalry between Spain and England culminated in one of the most iconic military campaigns of the early modern world, the launching and defeat of the Spanish Armada. The roots of the Anglo-Spanish War stretched back decades. When Philip II married Queen Mary of England in the year 1554, relations between the two Catholic monarchies were strong. But upon Mary's death in 1558, her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth ascended the throne. Philip proposed marriage to Elizabeth, hoping to preserve ties, but she declined. Over the years, the two kingdoms diverged sharply, religiously, politically, and economically. Elizabeth's reign was marked by support for Protestant movements abroad, especially in the Spanish Netherlands, where Dutch rebels were fighting for independence. English ships, including those led by Francis Drake, began harassing Spanish vessels and raiding colonial outposts, particularly in the Caribbean. These privateers operated with royal backing, blurring the lines between piracy and state-sanctioned warfare. Religious conflict added further fuel. As a staunch Catholic, Philip saw Elizabeth as a heretic ruling a kingdom that had strayed from the true faith. In 1570, Pope Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth and called on Catholic monarchs to depose her. While Philip did not act immediately, the papal declaration gave ideological weight to future hostilities. The final catalyst came in the year 1587, when Elizabeth executed Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic claimant to the English throne and a figure many Catholics viewed as a legitimate monarch. For Philip, this was not just a political offense, but a religious outrage. Soon after, he began assembling a fleet for what he called the Enterprise of England, a bold plan to invade the island, remove Elizabeth from power, and restore Catholic rule. The Armada was conceived as a two-part operation. Philip would send a fleet of warships from Spain to the English Channel. There, it would rendezvous with a Spanish army stationed in the Low Countries under the Duke of Parma. Together, they would cross the Channel, land in England, and march on London. The scale of the operation was immense. The fleet, once fully assembled, included over 130 ships, many of them heavily armed galleons. More than 20,000 sailors and soldiers were involved. Supplies of food, weapons, and ammunition were stockpiled in Spanish ports. It was one of the largest naval expeditions ever undertaken at that time. However, the execution of the plan was fraught with challenges from the beginning. The fleet set sail in May of 1588, but was delayed by storms, logistical issues, and difficulties coordinating with the land forces in the Netherlands. By the time the Armada reached the English Channel in late July, English forces were ready. The English Navy, though smaller, had several advantages. Their ships were faster and more maneuverable, equipped with long-range cannons that allowed them to strike from a distance. English commanders, such as Lord Charles Howard and Sir Francis Drake, used hit-and-run tactics to harass the Spanish formation. The Spanish ships, organized in a defensive crescent, struggled to respond effectively. One of the most decisive moments occurred at the Battle of Gravelines. The English launched fire ships, vessels set ablaze and sent drifting into the Spanish formation, causing chaos and forcing the Armada to break formation. In the ensuing battle, the English inflicted serious damage, and the Armada was driven northward. Unable to link up with the Duke of Parma and lacking a safe harbor, the Spanish fleet attempted to return home by sailing around Scotland and Ireland. Along the way, it encountered violent storms that wrecked many ships along the coasts. Fewer than half of the original vessels made it back to Spain. The defeat of the Armada was a major turning point. Though England remained cautious and the war continued for several more years, the psychological and symbolic impact was enormous. Protestant Europe celebrated the outcome as divine favor against Catholic aggression. Elizabeth emerged as a heroine and defender of her realm, and the English Navy gained new prestige. For Spain, the defeat was not catastrophic in terms of total military strength, but it was a blow to national pride and a setback to Philip's broader ambitions. He had spent years and vast resources planning the invasion, only to see it unravel due to poor coordination, bad weather, and effective English resistance. The Anglo-Spanish War continued for more than a decade after the Armada's failure. Both sides engaged in further naval skirmishes, colonial raids, and proxy conflicts. In 1596, a second Spanish Armada was launched, but also failed due to storms. Neither country could fully defeat the other, and the war eventually ended without a decisive resolution. Despite the defeat, Spain remained a dominant global power. Its control of American colonies, silver mines, and key trade routes continued. But the Armada's failure marked a symbolic shift. It showed that Spanish power could be challenged and that newer maritime powers like England could assert themselves on the global stage. The events of 1588 also ushered in a new era of naval warfare. The importance of ship design, firepower, and maneuverability became more evident. Nations began investing in permanent navies rather than relying solely on merchant vessels or hastily assembled fleets. Sea power became an essential component of imperial strategy. In retrospect, the Spanish Armada was a reflection of both the strength and the vulnerability of Spain at its peak. Philip II commanded the most powerful empire in the world, but his grand vision of religious and political unification proved difficult to realize. The complex logistics of coordinating a multinational invasion, combined with environmental factors and strong resistance, exposed the limits of even the most powerful monarch. The Armada left a lasting legacy in art, literature, and national memory. In Spain, it was remembered with a mixture of pride in the courage of its sailors and regret over the outcome. In England, it became a foundational myth of resistance and triumph, shaping national identity for centuries to come. As the 16th century drew to a close, Spain faced new challenges: economic strain, military overextension, and rising competition from other European powers. Yet its imperial structure remained strong, and its cultural and political influence continued to grow. While Spain waged war across seas and continents, while it expanded and defended an empire that circled the globe. A parallel story unfolded in its cities, churches, and theaters. This was the Spanish Golden Age, an extraordinary period of cultural, artistic, and intellectual brilliance that lasted roughly from the late 15th century to the early 17th century. It coincided with the reigns of Spain's most powerful monarchs, from Ferdinand and Isabella to Philip II and his successors. Yet, despite the constant background of conflict and imperial ambition, this era produced some of the most enduring works of literature, art, and architecture in European history. The roots of this cultural flourishing were complex. The influx of wealth from the Americas, the growth of urban centers, the expansion of universities, and the patronage of the monarchy and the church all played a role. But so too did the tension of the times, religious zeal, political control, and the contrasts between glory and decline, richness and hardship. Out of this tension emerged a rich body of work that reflected the concerns, beliefs, and imagination of early modern Spain. One of the most celebrated figures of this period was Miguel de Cervantes, author of Don Quixote. Born in the year 1547, Cervantes lived through much of the turbulent era of Philip II. He served as a soldier, was wounded at the Battle of Lepanto, and later spent years as a prisoner after being captured by pirates. His literary masterpiece, Don Quixote de la Mancha, published in 2 parts in the early 17th century, is widely regarded as the first modern novel. Don Quixote tells the story of an aging nobleman who, inspired by chivalric romances, sets out to become a knight-errant in a world that no longer values such ideals. Accompanied by his loyal squire, Sancho Panza, he experiences a series of misadventures, most famously mistaking windmills for giants. The novel is both comic and tragic, satirizing old values while also affirming the power of dreams. Through Quixote's delusions and determination, Cervantes explored themes of identity, perception, and the gap between reality and idealism. His work resonated not just in Spain but across Europe, influencing writers for centuries to come. Alongside literature, Spain witnessed a remarkable flourishing in the visual arts. One of the central figures in this artistic renaissance was El Greco, a painter of Greek origin who settled in Toledo in the late 16th century. His works are immediately recognizable for their elongated figures, dramatic lighting, and intense spiritual atmosphere. El Greco's paintings, such as The Burial of the Count of Orgaz and View of Toledo, blended Byzantine iconography with Renaissance techniques and Spanish mysticism. He brought a unique visual language to religious art, one that expressed the inner tension and ecstasy of faith in a deeply Catholic society. In the following generation, Diego Velázquez rose to prominence as court painter to King Philip IV. Born in Seville in 1599, Velázquez trained in the naturalistic tradition but soon developed a style of remarkable subtlety and realism. His portraits of the Spanish royal family and nobility, including Las Meninas and the Surrender of Breda, combined psychological depth with technical mastery. Las Meninas, in particular, remains one of the most studied paintings in Western art, notable for its complex composition and mysterious interaction between viewer, subject, and artist. Theater also experienced a golden age. Spanish playwrights created a vibrant dramatic tradition that blended classical influences with popular themes. Chief among them was Lope de Vega, a prolific and innovative dramatist who wrote hundreds of plays during his lifetime. He redefined Spanish theater by moving beyond strict classical unities and crafting dynamic stories that combined action, romance, honor, and humor. His works, such as Fuenteovejuna and The Dog in the Manger, portrayed both noble and common characters, often grappling with moral dilemmas and questions of justice. Lope de Vega's younger contemporary, Pedro Calderón de la Barca, continued and deepened this dramatic tradition. A soldier, priest, and philosopher, Calderón's plays explored themes of destiny, faith, and illusion. His most famous work, Life is a Dream, tells the story of a prince imprisoned since birth and forced to confront the boundaries between fate and free will, dream and reality. The play's poetic language and metaphysical depth made it a classic of the Spanish stage. Beyond individual authors and artists, the Spanish Golden Age saw the growth of intellectual and spiritual movements that shaped the broader culture. Universities in cities such as Salamanca and Alcalá de Henares became centers of theological debate and humanist scholarship. Scholars like Francisco de Vitoria and Domingo de Soto laid the groundwork for modern concepts of international law and ethics, especially in their discussions of just war and the rights of indigenous peoples in the Americas. Religion played a central role in shaping the intellectual and cultural environment. Spain, as the defender of Catholic orthodoxy, fostered a climate in which mysticism and devotion flourished alongside censorship and control. Figures such as Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross wrote deeply personal and poetic accounts of their spiritual experiences, emphasizing the inner journey toward divine union. Their writings were not only theological, but also literary masterpieces, combining metaphor, emotion, and philosophical insight. The architecture of the Spanish Golden Age reflected both grandeur and restraint. In ecclesiastical buildings, especially the Jesuit churches and royal chapels, the Baroque style began to take hold, marked by ornate facades and symbolic decoration. Secular architecture, particularly in Philip II's El Escorial, embraced a more austere aesthetic, favoring symmetry, order, and monumental scale. El Escorial itself was more than a palace. It was a statement of imperial identity, uniting royal authority, Catholic piety, and artistic ambition. The richness of Spain's cultural life during this period cannot be separated from the larger context of empire. The flow of wealth from the Americas supported artistic patronage, while imperial ideology infused works of art, literature, and scholarship. Yet even as Spain celebrated its imperial triumphs, many writers and thinkers began to reflect critically on the moral and spiritual cost of conquest and power. Cervantes, for example, portrayed characters who had returned from the Indies, disillusioned or corrupted by their experiences. The playwright Tirso de Molina introduced the legendary figure of Don Juan, a charming but immoral nobleman whose actions highlight the excesses of a society obsessed with status and pleasure. These cultural productions suggest that beneath the surface of imperial grandeur, there was a growing awareness of contradiction, tension, and decay. The Spanish Golden Age was not merely a celebration of empire, it was also a mirror held up to it. It gave voice to the hopes, doubts, and contradictions of a society at the center of global transformation. Its works continue to resonate because they captured not only the spirit of their time, but also the enduring questions of human identity, purpose, and morality. By the early 17th century, signs of strain were becoming more visible. Economic pressures, political challenges, and shifting power dynamics in Europe began to challenge Spain's dominance. Yet culturally, the legacy of the Golden Age endured. It left behind a body of work that would influence generations, not only within Spain, but across the world. As the Spanish Empire consolidated its hold over the Americas and defended its interests in Europe, it also looked across the Pacific Ocean toward new opportunities. Though often overshadowed by conquests in the Americas and wars on the continent, Spain's expansion into Asia was a crucial part of its imperial project. The establishment of a Spanish presence in the Philippines marked the beginning of a sustained and complex Pacific frontier, linking Asia, the Americas, and Europe in an unprecedented maritime network. The story of Spain's Pacific ambitions began shortly after Ferdinand Magellan's expedition circumnavigated the globe. Though Magellan himself was Portuguese, he sailed under the Spanish flag and set out in 1519 to find a westward route to the Spice Islands, known today as the Maluku Islands of Indonesia. In 1521, after crossing the Atlantic, navigating the treacherous strait at the southern tip of South America, and braving the vast Pacific, Magellan's expedition reached the Visayan Islands of what is now the central Philippines. Magellan was killed in a conflict with local warriors on the island of Mactan, but one of his ships, the Victoria, completed the voyage back to Spain in 1522, becoming the first vessel to circumnavigate the globe. Despite this success, Spain did not immediately establish a permanent presence in the region. The Portuguese, who claimed the Spice Islands through the Treaty of Tordesillas and subsequent agreements, fiercely guarded their Asian trading networks. For several decades, Spain focused on solidifying its American colonies and defending its Atlantic interests. But by the mid-16th century, interest in Asia had revived, driven by a desire for trade, conversion, and strategic competition with other European powers. The decisive move came under the leadership of Miguel López de Legazpi, a Basque navigator and administrator. In the year 1565, Legazpi led an expedition from New Spain, what is now Mexico, across the Pacific. He was accompanied by the Augustinian friar Andrés de Urdaneta, an experienced sailor and former member of Magellan's expedition. Their mission was to establish a permanent Spanish colony in the Philippines and to discover a viable return route across the Pacific, which had eluded previous explorers. Legazpi's fleet reached the central Philippine Islands and quickly began forging alliances with some indigenous leaders while confronting others with force. Over the next few years, he established Spanish control over Cebu and eventually moved north to Luzon, founding Manila in the year 1571. Manila's location, on a protected bay with access to inland waterways and proximity to Chinese trade routes, made it an ideal colonial capital. Manila soon became the hub of Spanish power in Asia. From this base, Spain extended its influence throughout the archipelago. Military expeditions subdued local resistance in various regions, though control outside the core areas of Luzon and Visayas remained limited for decades. The southern island of Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago, home to powerful Muslim sultanates, proved particularly resistant to Spanish rule and would remain zones of intermittent conflict for centuries. The Spanish presence in the Philippines was unique among its imperial ventures. Unlike the Americas, the islands did not offer large urban civilizations or vast stores of precious metals. Instead, their value lay in geography. The Philippines became a crucial node in global trade, connecting silver from the Americas with luxury goods from China, Japan, and Southeast Asia. This connection was formalized through the Manila galleon trade. Beginning in the 1570s, Spanish galleons sailed annually, or sometimes biannually, between Manila and Acapulco on the Pacific coast of New Spain. From Manila, ships carried Chinese silks, porcelain, spices, and other goods purchased in bustling Asian markets. From Acapulco, they returned with silver mined in New Spain and Peru. This trade route functioned as a global economic artery, circulating wealth and goods across hemispheres for more than 2 centuries. The voyage across the Pacific was long and perilous. Eastbound journeys were especially challenging due to prevailing winds and currents. Andrés de Urdaneta's navigational breakthrough, finding a return route northward toward Japan and then across to California before turning south to Mexico, made the Manila galleon possible. But even with this knowledge, storms, shipwrecks, and piracy remained constant threats. The galleon trade generated enormous profits for both private merchants and the Spanish crown. Manila's population swelled with Chinese traders, known as Sanglais, who became essential to the colonial economy. Chinese goods dominated the local market and were highly valued in Spanish America and Europe. However, these merchants were also viewed with suspicion by colonial authorities and the church, leading to periodic restrictions, expulsions, and even massacres, most notably in 1593 and again in the 17th century. Spanish rule in the Philippines was deeply tied to the Catholic Church. Missionary activity, led by the Augustinians, Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits, accompanied all military and political initiatives. Unlike the Americas, where large-scale conversions often built on existing religious systems, missionaries in the Philippines encountered a more fragmented spiritual landscape. Animist beliefs, Islamic influence in the south, and regional diversity made the task complex. Missionaries learned local languages, built churches, and established schools. The use of native languages in catechism and liturgy was more common than in the Americas. though this did not always prevent the erosion of indigenous traditions. By the end of the 16th century, large portions of Luzon and the Visayas were nominally Christian, and the church played a central role in social life, education, and local governance. Unlike in the Americas, where a formal encomienda system had been established, labor practices in the Philippines varied by region. Tribute collection, forced labor for public works, and corvée service were common. As in other parts of the Spanish Empire, indigenous communities were organized into reducciones, settlements designed to facilitate administration, Christianization, and taxation. The colonial government in Manila operated under the authority of the Governor-General, who was appointed by the Spanish crown but often came from the colonial elite in New Spain. The Philippines were officially under the jurisdiction of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which meant that much of their governance was influenced by Mexico rather than Madrid. This administrative arrangement helped integrate the Pacific territories into Spain's broader imperial structure. Despite Spain's efforts, control over the archipelago was never absolute. Geographic fragmentation, cultural diversity, and indigenous resistance meant that Spanish authority remained concentrated in select urban centers and surrounding provinces. The southern regions, especially Mindanao, remained largely autonomous under the rule of Muslim sultans who maintained their own trade networks and political systems. Military campaigns against these areas were frequent but rarely decisive. The arrival of other European powers in Asia eventually challenged Spanish dominance in the Pacific. The Dutch, English, and later the French sought their own footholds in the region, often by disrupting Spanish trade or supporting local resistance. The Dutch, in particular, seized the Spice Islands and conducted raids in the Philippines, though they never succeeded in taking Manila. These encounters reflected the growing competition for empire in Asia, with Spain's position increasingly strained. Still, the Philippines remained under Spanish control for more than 3 centuries, making it one of Spain's most enduring overseas possessions. It was the only significant Spanish colony in Asia and one of the few where Spanish influence persisted deeply into modern times. The legacy of Spanish rule is visible today in the Philippines' language, religion, legal systems, and place names. The Pacific expansion illustrates how Spain adapted its imperial model to new environments. The Philippines did not resemble the densely populated empires of Mexico or Peru, nor did they yield the same mineral wealth. But Spain recognized their strategic value, integrating them into a global trading network and using them as a platform for missionary and commercial outreach in Asia. By the early 17th century, Spain's empire was no longer simply Atlantic, it was fully global. From Seville to Mexico City, from Manila to Lima, the Spanish world was connected by ships, silver, soldiers, and scripture. This vast system required constant negotiation, adaptation, and control. And while the Philippines did not dominate the empire's revenues, they helped complete its reach. By the close of the 17th century, Spain remained a vast empire stretching across Europe, the Americas, and the Pacific. Yet beneath the surface of this global power lay growing signs of fatigue. The empire's economy was weakened by repeated wars, its bureaucracy overburdened, and its once mighty military increasingly reliant on alliances. But perhaps the most consequential threat to Spain's future came not from the battlefield or the marketplace, but from the royal court itself. When King Charles II of Spain died in the year 1700 without a direct heir, he left behind a fragile empire and a dangerous power vacuum. What followed was the War of the Spanish Succession, a dynastic and geopolitical conflict that would engulf much of Europe and change the balance of power in the world. Charles II was the last Habsburg monarch of Spain, and his reign was marked by physical frailty, political weakness, and administrative stagnation. Born in the year 1661, Charles suffered from a lifetime of health problems attributed to generations of inbreeding within the Habsburg dynasty. Despite his many titles, Charles was often described as passive and heavily influenced by his advisors. Most importantly, he remained childless, and the lack of an heir became a source of anxiety both in Spain and across Europe. The Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled Spain since the early 16th century, was deeply entwined with other European royal houses. As Charles's health declined, rival factions maneuvered to claim the Spanish throne. Two main candidates emerged: Philip, Duke of Anjou, the grandson of King Louis XIV of France and a member of the Bourbon dynasty, and Archduke Charles of Austria, a member of the Austrian Habsburg branch. Each had legitimate claims through bloodlines, and each had powerful allies eager to support them. Charles II's will named Philip of Anjou as his successor. The Spanish court, weary of decline and fearful of disintegration, hoped that Bourbon rule would bring stability and reform. But the prospect of uniting Spain and France under a single Bourbon crown alarmed the other European powers. England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire viewed such a union as a threat to the balance of power. If France and Spain were joined under one monarch, they could dominate Europe and control vast colonial territories, undermining the independence of other states. When Philip of Anjou accepted the Spanish crown as Philip V, war became inevitable. In the year 1701, the War of the Spanish Succession erupted, pitting a coalition of anti-Bourbon powers, England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and several German and Italian states, against France and Spain. The conflict would last over a decade, extending far beyond dynastic disputes to become a broader struggle for imperial and commercial dominance. The war was fought on multiple fronts. In Europe, major battles took place in the Spanish Netherlands, Italy, and Germany. The English army, led by the Duke of Marlborough, and the Austrian forces under Prince Eugene of Savoy, achieved several notable victories against French and Spanish troops. The Battle of Blenheim in 1704 and the Battle of Ramillies in 1706 weakened French influence in the Low Countries and pushed the war into French territory. In Spain itself, the war turned into a civil conflict. Castile generally supported Philip V, while the Crown of Aragon and regions like Catalonia sided with the Habsburg claimant, Archduke Charles. This internal division had deep historical roots. The centralizing Bourbon model, influenced by French absolutism, threatened the regional privileges and autonomy long enjoyed by Aragonese territories. In this context, the war was not just about dynastic succession, but about competing visions of monarchy and governance. Beyond Europe, the war extended into the Americas and the seas. Naval battles and colonial skirmishes occurred in the Caribbean, South America, and even as far as Newfoundland. British forces seized several Spanish and French outposts, hoping to disrupt their Atlantic trade networks. This early form of global conflict foreshadowed the imperial rivalries that would define the 18th century. As the war dragged on, its costs mounted. France suffered from famine, debt, and civil unrest. Spain's already weakened economy continued to decline, and its colonial administration struggled to maintain stability in the Americas. Meanwhile, the anti-Bourbon alliance began to fracture. In 1711, Emperor Joseph I of Austria died, and his brother, Archduke Charles, became Holy Roman Emperor. The prospect of uniting Spain and the Holy Roman Empire under a single Habsburg monarch now alarmed the same powers that had once supported Charles's claim. A compromise was urgently needed. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed, bringing an end to the war for most of the combatants. The treaty recognized Philip V as the legitimate king of Spain, but included an important condition. He and his descendants would renounce any claim to the French throne. This clause prevented the unification of the two crowns and restored a degree of balance to European politics. Spain, however, paid a heavy price. Under the terms of the treaty, it ceded several territories to its rivals. The Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and Sardinia were transferred to Austria. Gibraltar and Minorca were given to Great Britain, marking the beginning of British naval dominance in the Mediterranean. Spain's influence in Italy and Northern Europe was significantly reduced, signaling the end of its era as a preeminent European power. At home, Philip V began implementing reforms inspired by the French model of governance. The so-called Nueva Planta decrees abolished many of the regional privileges in Aragon, Catalonia, and Valencia, integrating them more directly into a centralized Spanish state. These changes diminished local autonomy and standardized administrative structures, bringing Spain closer to the model of absolutist monarchy pioneered by Louis XIV. Though controversial, these reforms laid the groundwork for a more modern and unified Spain. They marked the end of the composite monarchy that had characterized Habsburg rule and introduced a new vision of national identity. The Bourbon dynasty brought with it not only a new name, but a new political philosophy, one that emphasized uniformity, central authority, and rational governance. The War of the Spanish Succession was a watershed moment. It settled the question of succession, but revealed the limitations of Spanish power in a changing world. Spain remained a significant empire with vast colonial possessions and a vibrant culture, but it could no longer act as Europe's dominant force. The 18th century would be shaped by the rise of other powers, Britain, France, Prussia, and by the ongoing struggle to reform and preserve the Spanish imperial system. Section 14. Bourbon Reforms and Enlightened Absolutism. The conclusion of the War of the Spanish Succession left the Spanish Empire intact but diminished. Though Philip V retained the throne, Spain had lost key European territories and emerged from the conflict economically strained and institutionally stagnant. Recognizing that the empire could no longer rely on inertia or the legacy of past glories, the Bourbon monarchs, beginning with Philip V and especially his successors, launched a series of reforms throughout the 18th century aimed at revitalizing the imperial system. These efforts, now known collectively as the Bourbon Reforms, sought to centralize authority, boost efficiency, and harness Enlightenment ideals in service of absolutist monarchy. The Bourbon Reforms were not a single coordinated plan, but rather a collection of policies introduced gradually over several decades. They touched nearly every aspect of imperial life: governance, military organization, trade, taxation, the church, and even cultural institutions. Though inspired in part by French models, particularly those of Louis XIV, the reforms were shaped by the unique challenges of governing a transoceanic empire at a time when other powers, especially Britain, were gaining economic and naval superiority. One of the first priorities was administrative centralization. Under the earlier Habsburg system, Spain's empire had functioned as a patchwork of semi-autonomous kingdoms, viceroyalties, and provinces, each with its own legal codes, privileges, and power centers. This structure, though once effective, had become inefficient and resistant to reform. The Bourbon monarchs, beginning with Philip V and accelerating under Charles III, worked to eliminate regional exemptions and bring all territories under closer royal supervision. In the Americas, this meant a reorganization of colonial administration. New viceroyalties were created to improve oversight. The Viceroyalty of New Granada, encompassing modern-day Colombia and surrounding regions, was established in the early 18th century. Later, in the 1770s, the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata was created, centered in Buenos Aires, to manage the growing economic and political significance of southern South America. These new units allowed the Crown to reduce the dominance of older colonial centers like Lima and Mexico City, and to exercise more direct control over frontier regions. To further streamline administration, the Spanish Crown introduced the system of intendencias. Intendants were royal officials appointed to oversee fiscal matters, law enforcement, and local governance. Unlike traditional colonial elites, who often inherited their positions or purchased offices, intendants were salaried professionals accountable directly to the monarchy. Their presence curtailed the autonomy of local cabildos, municipal councils, and weakened the influence of powerful Criollo families. Economic reform was another major focus. The Bourbon monarchs aimed to reverse the decline of Spanish commerce and make the empire more self-sufficient and competitive. Trade restrictions imposed during the Habsburg era, which had limited commerce to a few approved ports and merchants, were gradually relaxed. Under the reign of Charles III, significant steps were taken to liberalize trade within the empire. In 1778, the Crown authorized comercio libre, or free trade, between most Spanish-American ports and the peninsula, reducing the dominance of the merchant guilds in Cadiz and Seville. This reform stimulated economic activity in colonial cities such as Havana, Caracas, and Buenos Aires. New industries developed, including tobacco processing, textile production, and shipbuilding. Colonial economies became more regionally diverse and less dependent on silver exports alone. However, increased competition also disrupted established patterns of trade and enriched a new class of merchant entrepreneurs, some peninsular, others Criollo, who would later play significant roles in independence movements. The Bourbon reforms also aimed to increase royal revenue. To achieve this, tax collection was made more efficient, and new taxes were introduced or expanded. Monopolies on goods such as tobacco, salt, and playing cards became major sources of income. The administration of royal treasuries was professionalized, reducing corruption, but also provoking resentment among those who had previously benefited from lax oversight or informal arrangements. One of the most controversial aspects of fiscal reform was the enhanced role of the military. The Bourbon monarchs believed that a strong empire required not only efficient governance but also robust defense. Local militias were reorganized and expanded, often composed of colonial-born Spaniards and even people of mixed ancestry. These militias trained under Spanish officers and participated in imperial defense, especially in coastal areas vulnerable to British or Dutch raids. While these efforts increased security, they also had unintended consequences. By arming and organizing colonial subjects, the Crown inadvertently created a generation of men with military training and leadership experience, many of whom would later become leaders of rebellion. Furthermore, these militias helped cultivate a sense of regional identity, distinct from that of the distant monarchy in Madrid. The Bourbon monarchs also sought to reassert control over the Catholic Church, which had long operated as a semi-autonomous institution within the empire. Through the use of regalismo, a doctrine asserting royal authority over ecclesiastical matters, the Crown reduced the power of religious orders and increased its oversight of church property, appointments, and finances. One of the most dramatic examples of this policy was the expulsion of the Jesuits from all Spanish territories in 1767. The Jesuits had been among the most influential missionaries and educators in the empire. They operated schools, missions, and economic enterprises across the Americas and the Philippines. However, their loyalty to the papacy, independence from local authorities, and growing wealth made them targets of royal suspicion. Their expulsion, carried out swiftly and often with violence, shocked colonial society. While the Crown justified the move as necessary for reform, it also alienated many Criollos who had been educated by Jesuits and admired their intellectual rigor. The Bourbon reforms extended into the cultural realm as well. Royal academies of art, science, and language were established or expanded in Madrid and the colonies. These institutions promoted Enlightenment ideals such as reason, order, and progress. The Spanish Crown encouraged scientific exploration, botanical expeditions, and mapping projects. Colonial cities saw the construction of new public buildings, improved infrastructure, and the standardization of architectural styles based on neoclassical models. Though inspired by the Enlightenment, the Bourbon reforms were not liberal in the modern sense. They were designed to strengthen royal authority and modernize the empire within the framework of absolutist rule. Yet, they introduced new ideas and practices that undermined traditional hierarchies. Education expanded, censorship was relaxed in some periods, and new forms of public debate emerged. Criollo elites began to see themselves not simply as subjects of the king, but as active participants in a wider world of knowledge and reform. Over time, this shift in consciousness created tension. While some Criollos supported the reforms, especially those that offered economic opportunity or reduced corruption, others resented the increasing presence of peninsular officials and the erosion of local privileges. The reforms revealed the contradictions of empire, an attempt to modernize and centralize that, in many ways, disrupted the delicate balance between crown and colony. By the end of the 18th century, Spain's empire appeared more streamlined and efficient than it had been a century earlier. Trade had increased, revenue had improved, and the military was better organized. But beneath the surface, new fault lines were forming. The very reforms intended to preserve the empire had empowered new actors, introduced destabilizing ideas, and intensified regional identities. While the Bourbon reforms of the 18th century sought to modernize and strengthen Spain's empire, they also disrupted long-standing power structures and intensified social inequalities. In many colonial regions, the reforms, though administratively effective, provoked resentment among indigenous communities, mestizos, and even Criollo elites. Increased taxation, forced labor, diminished local autonomy, and the growing presence of royal officials led to a series of uprisings that exposed the fragile legitimacy of Spanish rule in the Americas. These rebellions were not yet independence movements in the modern sense, but they revealed deep fractures in the imperial system and foreshadowed the revolutionary upheavals that would follow in the 19th century. One of the most significant early revolts occurred in New Granada, in the highlands of what is now Colombia, in the year 1781. Known as the Revolt of the Comuneros, it began as a response to the new taxes and monopolies introduced under the Bourbon fiscal reforms. The crown had imposed higher duties on tobacco, aguardiente, a sugarcane liquor, and playing cards, items deeply embedded in local economies and daily life. The collection of these taxes by unpopular agents, many of whom were perceived as corrupt or abusive, sparked protests among artisans, merchants, farmers, and indigenous communities. The rebellion began in the town of Socorro and quickly spread through surrounding provinces. Within weeks, tens of thousands of people had joined the movement. The rebels demanded the removal of corrupt officials, the abolition of new taxes, and the restoration of local privileges. As they marched toward Bogotá, the colonial capital, they gained support from towns along the route. In a dramatic development, royal officials in Bogotá agreed to negotiate and signed a document, the Capitulations of Zipaquirá, promising to address the rebels' grievances. However, once the movement dispersed and leaders returned home, the authorities revoked the concessions. Key figures in the uprising were arrested and executed. Though the rebellion failed to achieve lasting reform, it marked a turning point in popular resistance, revealing the willingness of colonial subjects to organize and challenge royal power when pushed beyond their limits. Elsewhere in the empire, the most explosive and sustained rebellion occurred in the Andes under the leadership of José Gabriel Condorcanqui, better known by his adopted name, Tupac Amaru II. A member of the local indigenous nobility and a direct descendant of the last Inca rulers, Tupac Amaru emerged as a charismatic figure who could bridge indigenous traditions and Spanish legal frameworks. Educated by Jesuits and fluent in both Spanish and Quechua, he used his position as a curaca, indigenous magistrate, to articulate demands for justice and reform. The revolt began in 1780 when Tupac Amaru seized and executed a Spanish colonial administrator accused of corruption and abuse. From there, the movement spread rapidly through the southern highlands of Peru. Unlike previous uprisings, which were often localized and short-lived, this rebellion developed into a full-scale regional conflict. Tens of thousands of indigenous people joined the movement, attacking colonial outposts, disrupting trade routes, and challenging both the local elite and Spanish authority. Tupac Amaru's program combined appeals to Inca heritage with Enlightenment-era ideas of justice and reform. He called for the abolition of the mita, forced labor system, the end of sales taxes, and the expulsion of corrupt Spanish officials. He did not initially call for independence from Spain, but envisioned a reformed monarchy that respected indigenous rights and restored local autonomy. However, the uprising quickly grew beyond his control. In some regions, the rebellion took on a more radical and violent character, with rebels attacking churches, killing Spaniards and Criollos, and invoking apocalyptic visions of indigenous renewal. The Spanish colonial authorities responded with overwhelming force. After months of pursuit and battles, Tupac Amaru was captured in 1781. He was brutally executed in the main square of Cusco, along with his family and supporters, in an effort to destroy the symbolic power of his movement. Despite its failure, the rebellion had a profound impact. It exposed the depth of dissatisfaction with colonial rule and the enduring strength of indigenous political identity. The harsh repression that followed, including mass executions, destruction of indigenous texts, and tighter surveillance, aimed to erase all traces of Inca revivalism. Yet the memory of Tupac Amaru remained powerful. His name and image would later be invoked by independence fighters and, centuries later, by political movements seeking to reclaim indigenous identity and autonomy. Similar patterns of unrest appeared across the Spanish Empire in the late 18th century. In Upper Peru, modern-day Bolivia, indigenous communities revolted under the leadership of Tupac Katari, who laid siege to La Paz for several months. In Ecuador, Maya communities resisted land seizures and forced labor demands. In Mexico, smaller uprisings flared in rural areas, fueled by land disputes, crop failures, and resentment toward Spanish monopolies. Many of these revolts had religious dimensions. Indigenous Catholicism had evolved into a syncretic faith that blended Christian rituals with local traditions. When Spanish authorities imposed new taxes on sacraments or limited access to sacred spaces, they often provoked resistance. Millenarian beliefs, expectations of divine intervention, the return of a golden age, or the reappearance of ancient rulers, infused several movements with a sense of destiny. While these uprisings were not coordinated, they revealed a shared sense of betrayal and a loss of faith in colonial institutions. The Criollo elites also experienced a growing sense of exclusion. Though they were often wealthier and better educated than peninsular officials, Criollos were systematically denied access to the highest offices in the church, the military, and the civil administration. The Bourbon preference for peninsulares created a closed loop of privilege that alienated many locally born Spaniards. The reforms, meant to centralize and modernize, had the unintended effect of marginalizing those who had previously identified strongly with the imperial system. This discontent was compounded by the spread of Enlightenment ideas. Through books, pamphlets, and conversations in salons and universities, colonial intellectuals encountered new theories of governance, rights, and reason. Thinkers such as Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire were read and discussed in Lima, Mexico City, and Bogotá. While the church and crown attempted to censor radical material, Enlightenment concepts nonetheless seeped into public discourse, offering new ways to critique authority and imagine alternatives. The influence of external events also played a role. The American Revolution demonstrated that colonies could challenge European rule and establish their own systems of government. The French Revolution, though initially welcomed by some reform-minded Criollos, soon alarmed colonial authorities with its radicalism and anti-clericalism. News of the Haitian Revolution in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, where enslaved people overthrew their masters and declared independence, deeply unsettled both colonial elites and Spanish officials. These revolutions suggested that change was possible, but they also highlighted the risks of social upheaval. By the turn of the 19th century, the Spanish Empire faced growing uncertainty. While it remained territorially vast and institutionally robust, its foundations were increasingly shaky. The Bourbon reforms had strengthened some parts of the state, but weakened others. Indigenous and popular resistance revealed enduring fractures, while Criollo frustration created a widening gap between local identities and imperial loyalty. In many ways, the uprisings of the late 18th century were warnings, signals that the old structures could no longer contain the pressures building within the empire. Though these revolts were suppressed, they marked the beginning of the end. Within a few decades, colonial subjects across Latin America would rise again, this time not simply to reform the empire, but to break away from it entirely. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Spanish Empire stood as one of the world's most extensive imperial structures, with dominions stretching from the Andes to the Pacific, from California to the Philippines. But beneath this grandeur, the empire was fraying. The Bourbon reforms had alienated key segments of colonial society, and earlier rebellions had already shown how fragile royal authority had become in the Americas. Now, a crisis unfolding in Spain itself would shake the empire to its core. When Napoleon Bonaparte invaded the Iberian Peninsula in 1808, the resulting collapse of royal authority ignited a revolutionary chain reaction across the Atlantic. The Napoleonic Wars had been raging across Europe since the turn of the century. France, under the leadership of Napoleon, had conquered large parts of the continent and restructured political systems in its wake. Spain, initially an ally of France under the reign of Charles IV, found itself drawn into a complex web of shifting alliances and betrayals. The Spanish monarchy, weakened by court intrigues and widespread corruption, was ill-prepared for what lay ahead. In 1807, Napoleon and the Spanish crown agreed to the Treaty of Fontainebleau, which permitted French troops to cross Spain in order to attack Portugal, a British ally. But under the guise of cooperation, Napoleon began stationing more and more troops within Spanish territory. Then, in a stunning political move, he forced both King Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII to abdicate the throne during a staged meeting in the French town of Bayonne. Napoleon installed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as the new king of Spain. This act of dynastic substitution shocked and outraged many Spaniards. For centuries, the monarchy had been seen not just as a source of power, but as the symbolic center of national and religious identity. Napoleon's intervention was viewed not simply as a military occupation, but as an existential threat to Spanish sovereignty and tradition. The response was swift and fierce. In May of 1808, the people of Madrid rose in spontaneous revolt against the French garrison. Though the uprising was suppressed with brutal efficiency, it ignited a wider resistance movement. Throughout the country, guerrilla bands formed to fight the French occupation. These irregular fighters used ambushes, sabotage, and local knowledge to undermine French control, a style of warfare that would give rise to the term guerrilla, meaning little war. Simultaneously, cities and provinces across Spain began forming juntas, or local councils, to govern in the absence of a legitimate monarch. These juntas claimed to act in the name of the deposed Ferdinand VII and refused to recognize Joseph Bonaparte. Eventually, the various regional juntas coordinated to establish the Supreme Central Junta, which attempted to organize the resistance and govern the country during the crisis. While the war raged in Spain itself, events in the colonies began to take on a momentum of their own. News of the French invasion and the abdications of Charles and Ferdinand reached the Americas in mid to late 1808. Colonial officials and Criollo elites found themselves in an unprecedented situation. There was no clear, legitimate king, and the central authority in Madrid was in chaos. The question now loomed: who held sovereignty over the colonies? In the absence of direct royal authority, several cities in Spanish America began forming their own juntas, claiming to act in the name of Ferdinand VII. These juntas, established by Criollo elites, were initially framed as loyalist institutions, not as revolutionary bodies. Yet their formation was deeply unsettling to peninsular officials, many of whom viewed them as illegal and rebellious. Tensions escalated quickly between the supporters of these juntas and the remaining royalist forces loyal to the regime in Cadiz or to Joseph Bonaparte. The political vacuum created by Napoleon's actions allowed long-simmering tensions in the colonies to surface. Criollo resentment of peninsular dominance, economic grievances, and Enlightenment ideas about representation and popular sovereignty began to combine in unpredictable ways. What had started as a constitutional crisis soon evolved into something far more revolutionary. In 1810, major cities across Spanish America declared their own autonomous governments. In Caracas, Buenos Aires, Bogotá, and Santiago, juntas were formed that claimed to govern until Ferdinand VII could be restored. But these were not mere placeholders. Many of these new governments began asserting increasing control over their territories, implementing reforms, and in some cases, severing ties with colonial authorities. The Peninsular War, as the conflict in Spain came to be known, was itself a brutal and grinding affair. The Spanish resistance, backed by British forces under the Duke of Wellington, slowly pushed back against the French occupation. Major battles at Salamanca, Vitoria, and elsewhere eroded French control. By 1814, Napoleon was forced to abdicate, and Ferdinand VII was restored to the Spanish throne. But the restoration came too late to reverse the course of events in the Americas. During the 6 years of war, the colonies had experienced a profound political awakening. New institutions had been built. Revolutionary leaders had emerged. Militias had been raised, and popular support mobilized. Though some territories welcomed Ferdinand's return and attempted to reintegrate into the empire, others had moved too far down the path of independence to turn back. In Spain itself, the return of Ferdinand VII marked a retreat from reform. Rejecting the liberal constitution of Cadiz, which had been drafted during the French occupation, Ferdinand re-established absolutist rule. He dismissed the Cortes, Parliament, rolled back civil liberties, and launched a campaign to restore centralized monarchical control over the colonies. But the momentum of revolution could not be so easily undone. The Napoleonic invasion, then, marked a critical rupture. It shattered the illusion of unbroken royal continuity and demonstrated that sovereignty could be redefined. The war radicalized both Spaniards and colonials. In Spain, it fostered nationalism, anti-French sentiment, and constitutional aspirations. In the Americas, it opened the door to revolution, independence, and the reimagining of political order. It also redefined the language of legitimacy. Previously, Spanish monarchs had ruled by divine right and inheritance. But now, new ideas had taken root. That government derived its authority from the people, that representation mattered, and that distant monarchs could not govern effectively without local consent. Even those who initially claimed loyalty to Ferdinand began to question the nature of empire itself. In terms of global impact, the war revealed the vulnerability of empires built on dynastic claims and centralized authority. It showed how internal instability could ripple across oceans, shaking even the most powerful colonial systems. And it provided a new model of resistance, in which both military action and the construction of alternative political institutions could challenge imperial rule. By the end of the Peninsular War in 1814, the Spanish world had changed forever. Although the monarchy had been restored, its legitimacy in the Americas had been fatally undermined. The political experiments and mobilizations that emerged during the war would soon evolve into full-fledged movements for independence. By the early 19th century, the Spanish Empire in the Americas was approaching a critical breaking point. While earlier sections of the empire's history were marked by conquest, colonization, and reform, the years following the Napoleonic invasion of Spain brought a new and decisive chapter: revolution. What began as political uncertainty in the wake of the French occupation of the Iberian Peninsula evolved into a series of revolutionary movements that swept through Spanish America. These movements, led by Criollo leaders, supported by diverse social groups, and fueled by changing ideas of legitimacy and sovereignty, ultimately brought an end to centuries of Spanish colonial rule. The collapse of royal authority during the Napoleonic Wars had created an unprecedented power vacuum. Although Ferdinand VII was restored to the throne in 1814, his return did little to heal the imperial system. In fact, his decision to reject the liberal constitution of Cadiz and reinstate absolutist rule alienated many across the Atlantic. The idea that Spanish America should remain permanently subject to a distant monarch with absolute powers was increasingly untenable. The political foundations of empire were crumbling. The revolutionary process did not unfold uniformly. Rather, it erupted in waves across different regions, each with its own social dynamics, leadership, and historical trajectory. In the northern part of South America, the independence movement was shaped by the leadership of Simón Bolívar, a wealthy Criollo from Caracas. Educated in Europe and inspired by Enlightenment philosophy as well as the example of the French and American revolutions, Bolívar emerged as a charismatic and tireless advocate for Latin American independence. Bolívar's vision was broader than mere separation from Spain. He imagined a united continent, one in which the former Spanish colonies could form a single confederation to preserve liberty and resist foreign intervention. His campaigns began in Venezuela but faced early setbacks, including the collapse of republican governments and fierce royalist resistance. Still, Bolívar persisted. He took refuge in New Granada, modern Colombia, regrouped, and launched new campaigns from the interior. One of the most remarkable episodes of his military career was the crossing of the Andes in 1819, a daring maneuver that brought his army into the heart of the viceroyalty of New Granada. After a grueling march through treacherous terrain, Bolívar's forces won a decisive victory at the Battle of Boyacá. This victory secured the independence of Colombia and paved the way for the creation of Gran Colombia, a short-lived union that included Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama. In the southern cone of South America, the path to independence was shaped by a different figure, José de San Martín. Born in the Rio de la Plata region and trained in Spain's military, San Martín returned to South America in the early years of revolution. Like Bolívar, he believed in liberation from Spanish rule, but he favored a more centralized and orderly process. He began his campaign in Argentina, helping to secure the region's independence and establishing a stable base from which to operate. San Martín then turned his attention to Chile. In 1817, he led an army across the Andes in one of the most audacious campaigns of the independence wars. The crossing required months of preparation and extraordinary endurance. The result was a resounding victory at the Battle of Chacabuco, which allowed San Martín to enter Santiago and secure Chilean independence. From there, he prepared to move into Peru, the heart of Spanish power in South America. In 1821, San Martín entered Lima and declared Peruvian independence. Yet consolidating control over Peru would prove far more difficult. Royalist forces remained strong in the highlands, and San Martín lacked the resources and support to complete the campaign alone. In 1822, he met with Bolívar in Guayaquil to discuss strategy. The details of their meeting remain partially unclear, but shortly afterward, San Martín withdrew from the conflict, leaving Bolívar to take command of the final campaigns. Bolívar and his general, Antonio José de Sucre, launched a military offensive into the Andean highlands, culminating in two major victories, the Battle of Junín and the Battle of Ayacucho, both fought in 1824. The victory at Ayacucho effectively ended Spanish rule in South America. Royalist armies were defeated, their commanders captured, and the last bastions of colonial power surrendered or disintegrated. Meanwhile, in Mexico, a different revolutionary path had unfolded. The initial revolt began in 1810 when Miguel Hidalgo, a parish priest, issued the Grito de Dolores, a call to arms that summoned indigenous and mestizo peasants to rise against Spanish authorities. Hidalgo's rebellion spread rapidly across central Mexico, fueled by social grievances, anti-colonial sentiment, and the promise of land reform. However, his movement lacked clear military discipline, and royalist forces quickly regained control. Hidalgo was captured and executed in 1811. Leadership of the movement passed to José María Morelos, another priest who proved to be a more capable organizer and strategist. Morelos convened a Congress that declared Mexican independence, established a constitution, and called for the abolition of slavery and class privileges. Yet he, too, was eventually captured and executed. The early phase of the Mexican independence struggle had been driven largely by popular forces, but it struggled to find lasting cohesion. Ironically, the final success of the independence movement came when conservative elements in Mexico, fearful of liberal reforms in Spain and growing instability, joined the cause. In 1821, Agustín de Iturbide, a royalist officer turned insurgent, negotiated with rebel leaders to agree on a plan for independence. The Plan of Iguala proposed three guarantees: independence from Spain, the preservation of Catholicism, and the protection of Criollo privileges. Iturbide entered Mexico City in triumph, and Spanish authority in Mexico effectively ended. In Central America, independence was declared in the same year, largely influenced by the events in Mexico. The newly free provinces briefly joined the Mexican Empire under Iturbide, but soon formed their own federation. Though short-lived, this Central American experiment reflected the broader desire across the continent to find new political arrangements independent of colonial rule. The Caribbean posed particular challenges to the independence movements. In Cuba and Puerto Rico, Spanish control remained intact throughout the early 19th century, thanks in part to large loyalist populations, fear of slave revolts, and strategic military presence. These islands would not achieve independence until much later in the century and under very different circumstances. The Latin American Wars of Independence radically transformed the political map of the Western Hemisphere. In less than 2 decades, Spain lost nearly all of its American territories. Only a few outposts remained under its control, and the dream of a unified Spanish Empire in the New World had come to an end. Yet the revolutions left complex legacies. The new nations were often politically unstable, plagued by civil wars, caudillo rule, and struggles over land and power. The transition from colonial to national rule was uneven and often violent. Social inequalities persisted, and the hopes of many indigenous, Afro-descended, and poor communities remained unfulfilled. Nevertheless, the revolutions had irreversibly broken the old imperial order and introduced new possibilities for sovereignty, citizenship, and national identity. For Spain, the loss of its American colonies was more than a geopolitical setback. It was an existential crisis. The empire that had once commanded the wealth of the Indies now faced the challenge of redefining its role in a changing world. In the next section, we will explore how Spain confronted the aftermath of imperial collapse and attempted to hold on to its remaining colonies in the face of rising global pressures. As the dust settled from the wars of independence across Latin America, Spain found itself ruling over an empire that had drastically contracted. From being the most extensive global empire in the early modern period, it had, by the middle of the 19th century, been reduced to a handful of overseas territories: Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and several smaller enclaves in Africa and the Pacific. Though Spain retained sovereignty over these regions, its imperial prestige had been badly shaken, its economy was underdeveloped, and its political institutions were increasingly unstable. The 19th century became a long period of imperial retreat, punctuated by revolts, reform attempts, and mounting global pressures. The Spanish state that emerged from the Napoleonic Wars was deeply fractured. The restoration of Ferdinand VII in 1814 marked a return to absolutist rule, as the king rejected the liberal constitution of Cadiz and dissolved representative institutions. This reactionary stance alienated many who had fought for independence in the name of constitutional monarchy and popular representation. Although Ferdinand briefly reinstated the constitution under military pressure during the so-called Trienio Liberal from 1820 to 1823, his reign remained largely hostile to reform and modernization. Upon his death in 1833, a new dynastic crisis erupted. Ferdinand had named his daughter, Isabella II, as his heir. However, a conservative faction within the military and aristocracy rejected the legitimacy of a female monarch and instead supported the claims of Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos. This dispute triggered the Carlist Wars, a series of civil conflicts that would destabilize Spain for decades. The Carlist Wars were not merely dynastic struggles, they also represented competing visions for Spain's future. The Carlists supported traditional monarchy, regional privileges, known as fueros, and the close alliance between throne and church. In contrast, the supporters of Isabella, known as liberals or Cristinos, championed constitutional government, centralized authority, and limited reforms. Though the liberals ultimately triumphed, the wars severely weakened the state, diverted resources, and hindered effective governance, both at home and in the remaining colonies. Despite internal turmoil, Spain attempted to retain and even strengthen its hold on its last major overseas possessions. Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines remained economically vital due to their agricultural exports, particularly sugar, tobacco, and coffee. However, these colonies were undergoing transformations of their own. In Cuba, the plantation economy was expanding rapidly, powered by enslaved African labor. Though Spain had agreed in principle to abolish the transatlantic slave trade, enforcement was inconsistent, and illegal trafficking continued well into the 19th century. Tensions in Cuba grew steadily as a new generation of Creole elites, many educated in Europe and influenced by liberal ideals, began to question Spanish rule. Economic grievances, racial inequalities, and demands for political representation fueled unrest. In 1868, the 10 Years' War broke out when Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, a Cuban landowner, issued the Grito de Yara, declaring Cuban independence and freeing his enslaved workers. The conflict evolved into a prolonged guerrilla war between Spanish forces and Cuban insurgents. Although the rebels achieved some military success and gained international sympathy, they lacked unity and sufficient external support. Spain responded with harsh repression, deploying large numbers of troops and using scorched earth tactics. The war ended in 1878 with the Pact of Zanjan, which granted limited reforms but fell far short of independence or the abolition of slavery, which was not formally achieved in Cuba until the mid-1880s. In Puerto Rico, unrest took a different form. Though smaller and less violently rebellious than Cuba, the island experienced its own independence movement. In 1868, the same year the Cuban Rebellion began, Puerto Rican nationalists launched the Grito de Lares, a short-lived revolt that was quickly suppressed. While not as militarily significant, the uprising revealed the growing discontent among Puerto Ricans over colonial governance, economic inequality, and lack of representation. Spain responded by offering minor reforms, including limited local assemblies and broader civil rights for island residents. But these measures did little to satisfy deeper aspirations for self-determination. In the Philippines, Spanish authority was likewise challenged by new political currents. The archipelago, long ruled through a combination of missionary power and bureaucratic oversight, had seen relatively little large-scale rebellion since the 17th century. However, the spread of secular education, the emergence of a Filipino-educated elite known as the Ilustrados, and increasing racial discrimination by Spanish officials created fertile ground for reformist and eventually nationalist sentiment. A key figure of this period was José Rizal, a physician, novelist, and intellectual whose writings exposed the injustices of Spanish rule. His novels Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo criticized the abuses of friars and colonial administrators while promoting a vision of peaceful reform and Filipino identity. Though Rizal never advocated outright revolution, his ideas inspired a growing movement for change. The execution of Rizal in 1896, following the outbreak of the Katipunan-led uprising led by Andrés Bonifacio, marked a turning point. The Philippine Revolution began in earnest, challenging Spanish rule on multiple fronts. Although initial rebel gains were suppressed, the conflict set the stage for the far-reaching events that would follow at the end of the century. Meanwhile, in Spain itself, the late 19th century was marked by attempts to modernize the political system through constitutional monarchy. After the brief reign and abdication of King Amadeo I and a short-lived republic, the Bourbon monarchy was restored under Alfonso XII in 1874. The Restoration period brought relative political stability, but it relied heavily on managed elections, elite agreements, and limited popular participation. Genuine reform remained elusive. Despite efforts to strengthen its remaining colonial presence, Spain found itself increasingly outmatched by rising global powers. Britain, France, the United States, and even Japan were building modern navies, expanding industrial economies, and projecting imperial power with increasing sophistication. Spain, by contrast, struggled with financial constraints, outdated military equipment, and political fragmentation. The emergence of nationalist movements in the colonies coincided with this broader decline. Spain's efforts to suppress dissent often backfired, deepening opposition and alienating potential allies. Calls for home rule, civil rights, and economic modernization were met with repression, exile, or token reforms that failed to address deeper structural issues. By the closing decades of the 19th century, it had become clear that Spain's hold over its remaining colonies was no longer sustainable. The long wars in Cuba, the rise of Filipino nationalism, and mounting international pressure were converging into an inevitable crisis. By the final years of the 19th century, Spain's imperial presence had shrunk to a handful of overseas territories. The Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam were all that remained of an empire that had once spanned the globe. Spain had lost nearly all of its American colonies earlier in the century, and its rule over the remaining ones was increasingly contested by nationalist movements and foreign powers. The Spanish-American War of 1898 would bring this long imperial retreat to a dramatic and final collapse. Though the war itself lasted only a few months, it had profound consequences, not just for Spain and its colonies, but also for the global order emerging at the dawn of the 20th century. The roots of the conflict lay primarily in Cuba, where nationalist sentiment had reached a boiling point. The 10 Years' War, which began in 1868, had ended without achieving full independence. The promise of reform had gone unfulfilled, and slavery had been abolished only in the 1880s. Economic hardship coupled with continued political repression fueled renewed rebellion. In 1895, a second and more coordinated war for independence broke out, led by the Cuban Revolutionary Party and key figures such as José Martí, Máximo Gómez, and Antonio Macheo. José Martí, a poet, journalist, and political thinker, had spent much of his life in exile, working tirelessly to unite the Cuban exile community and promote the cause of independence. He returned to Cuba in 1895 and died early in the conflict, becoming a martyr for the nationalist cause. His writings laid the ideological foundation for Cuban nationhood, blending Enlightenment values, Latin American identity, and a deep rejection of both colonialism and foreign domination. The war in Cuba became increasingly brutal. Spanish authorities under General Valeriano Weyler implemented a policy of reconcentration, forcibly relocating rural populations into camps to cut off support for the rebels. The conditions in these camps were appalling. Disease, malnutrition, and overcrowding led to widespread suffering. Reports of these humanitarian abuses reached international audiences, particularly in the United States, where sympathy for the Cuban cause was growing. American newspapers, especially those run by publishers such as William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, played a central role in shaping public opinion. Through sensationalist and often exaggerated reporting, known as yellow journalism, they depicted the Cuban struggle in dramatic terms, portraying Spain as a tyrannical oppressor and the Cubans as heroic freedom fighters. Public pressure on the U.S. government to intervene intensified, even as President William McKinley initially pursued a cautious approach. The tipping point came in February of 1898, when the USS Maine, an American battleship stationed in Havana Harbor, exploded under mysterious circumstances, killing over 200 sailors. Although the exact cause of the explosion remains debated, the event was widely blamed on Spain by the American press and public. The rallying cry, "Remember the Maine," became a powerful slogan demanding war. Under growing domestic pressure, the United States issued an ultimatum to Spain, demanding the end of its rule in Cuba. When Spain refused, war was declared in April of 1898. The Spanish-American War had begun. Spain entered the conflict with significant disadvantages. Its military was overstretched, underfunded, and poorly equipped. Decades of political instability had weakened its institutions, and its naval forces, though once formidable, were no match for the increasingly modern and industrialized American fleet. Moreover, Spain faced simultaneous uprisings in Cuba and the Philippines, straining its ability to respond effectively on multiple fronts. The war unfolded rapidly. In the Pacific, the first major engagement came at the Battle of Manila Bay. On May 1st, the American Asiatic Squadron, under Commodore George Dewey, destroyed the Spanish Pacific Fleet in a matter of hours, seizing control of Manila's harbor and setting the stage for the eventual U.S. occupation of the Philippines. In the Caribbean, the conflict focused primarily on Cuba and Puerto Rico. American forces landed in Cuba in June, joining Cuban rebels already engaged in guerrilla warfare. Battles at Las Guasimas, El Caney, and San Juan Hill, where Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders gained notoriety, captured public attention in the United States. Despite the romanticized portrayals in American media, Cuban and Afro-Cuban soldiers played a critical role in these engagements, often providing crucial local knowledge and manpower. The Spanish Caribbean Fleet, commanded by Admiral Pascual Cervera, attempted to break out from Santiago Harbor but was intercepted and destroyed by the U.S. Navy in July. With no means to resupply or reinforce, Spanish forces surrendered Santiago soon after. Puerto Rico was invaded shortly afterward, encountering limited resistance. By August, a ceasefire had been agreed upon, and formal peace negotiations began in Paris. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December of 1898, marked the end of the Spanish-American War and the formal collapse of Spain's overseas empire. Under its terms, Spain ceded control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. While Cuba was granted nominal independence, its sovereignty was heavily constrained by U.S. influence, particularly under the Platt Amendment. The Philippines became an American colony, sparking a new and bloody war of resistance by Filipino nationalists that would last several years. For Spain, the defeat was a profound national trauma. The loss of its final major colonies forced a reckoning with its imperial legacy and its place in the modern world. The war exposed the deep weaknesses of the Spanish state, its military obsolescence, political dysfunction, and failure to modernize. The event is often referred to in Spanish history as the Disaster of 98, El Desastre del 98, and it catalyzed a period of intense reflection and intellectual debate. A new generation of Spanish thinkers and writers, known as the Generation of 98, emerged to confront the cultural and philosophical implications of the empire's collapse. Figures such as Miguel de Unamuno, Pío Baroja, and Antonio Machado questioned Spain's identity, critiqued its past, and debated the path forward. While some mourned the loss of empire, others saw the opportunity for regeneration through internal reform, education, and cultural renewal. Economically, Spain began to redirect its energies inward. Without the costs of maintaining a far-flung empire, the country slowly began to industrialize and modernize, though this process remained uneven and deeply influenced by regional divisions. Politically, however, the country remained unstable, with growing tensions between monarchists, republicans, socialists, and regional nationalists. These internal conflicts would continue to shape Spanish history well into the 20th century. Internationally, the war marked a turning point. The United States emerged as a global power with overseas colonies and new strategic responsibilities. The shift from Spanish to American imperialism in the Caribbean and Pacific represented not just a transfer of territory, but a transformation in the dynamics of global power. The age of European maritime empires was waning, and new industrial and continental powers were rising to take their place. For the former colonies, the end of Spanish rule did not bring immediate freedom. In the Philippines, the revolutionary movement led by Emilio Aguinaldo, which had fought against Spain, now had to confront American occupation. In Cuba, independence came with strings attached, and U.S. influence would dominate the island for decades. Puerto Rico and Guam became unincorporated territories of the United States, beginning a new chapter of colonial governance under a different flag. The Spanish-American War thus marked both an end and a beginning. For Spain, it was the final act of a centuries-long imperial drama that had reshaped the world. For the United States, it was the beginning of a new era of overseas expansion. And for the peoples of the Caribbean and the Pacific, it signaled the end of one colonial era and the uncertain beginning of another. The formal end of the Spanish Empire came with the Treaty of Paris in the final years of the 19th century, when Spain surrendered its last major colonies to the United States. Yet the legacy of empire did not vanish with the lowering of Spanish flags in Havana, Manila, or San Juan. It remained embedded in the language, institutions, identities, and everyday lives of millions of people across the globe. From legal systems to religious practices, from literature to architecture, the imprint of Spanish rule endured long after its political power had waned. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Spanish Empire is its language. Today, Spanish is the second most spoken native language in the world, used by hundreds of millions of people across the Americas, Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia. From Mexico to Argentina, from California to Chile, Spanish remains a foundational part of national identity and social life. It is the official or national language in more than 20 countries, a remarkable testament to the linguistic reach of the empire. This widespread use of Spanish did not emerge solely from coercion or colonial decree. While it was initially imposed through administration, education, and missionary work, Spanish was also adopted and adapted by local populations. In many regions, it became a shared language among diverse indigenous groups who previously spoke mutually unintelligible tongues. Over time, Spanish itself evolved into distinct regional forms, giving rise to dialects, slang, and accents that reflect the cultural complexity of each society. But even as Spanish spread, indigenous languages persisted. In countries such as Paraguay, Bolivia, Guatemala, and Peru, native tongues like Guarani, Quechua, Aymara, and Maya have survived and, in some cases, gained official recognition. The interaction between Spanish and these languages created hybrid forms of expression, linguistic landscapes where colonial and pre-colonial elements coexisted and influenced one another. Another major legacy of empire is Catholicism. From the earliest days of Spanish colonization, the Catholic Church was a central pillar of imperial policy. Missionaries converted millions of indigenous people, established parishes and monasteries, and built churches that often physically dominated the colonial townscape. Today, Catholicism remains a major religion across much of Latin America and the Philippines. It continues to shape festivals, family traditions, education, and politics. The Catholic Church's influence extended beyond spiritual life. It was deeply involved in education, healthcare, and social services throughout the colonial period and into the post-independence era. Religious brotherhoods and lay organizations played key roles in community cohesion and cultural continuity. Even where secularism gained ground in the 19th and 20th centuries, Catholic symbols and moral frameworks remained deeply woven into national narratives and institutions. Yet the religious legacy of empire is not without complexity. In many regions, Catholicism merged with indigenous spiritual practices, giving rise to syncretic traditions. In Mexico, for example, the Day of the Dead combines pre-Columbian rituals with Catholic concepts of All Saints and All Souls Days. In the Andes, indigenous communities continue to venerate mountain spirits alongside Christian saints. In the Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean religions such as Santeria and Vodou reflect the blending of Catholic imagery with African belief systems, shaped in part by Spanish colonial contexts. Legal and political institutions also bear the mark of Spanish imperial rule. The Spanish crown introduced a highly formalized legal system across its territories, rooted in Roman law and codified in complex legal texts such as the laws of the Indies and the Siete Partidas. These frameworks emphasized royal sovereignty, bureaucratic hierarchy, and a structured approach to land, property, and labor relations. Many independent nations retained and modified these legal traditions after achieving sovereignty. Civil law systems across Latin America and the Philippines still reflect Spanish influence in their codes, procedures, and jurisprudence. The role of the notary, the structure of municipal government, and the importance of written legal contracts are just a few examples of institutional continuity. Urban design offers another window into the legacy of empire. The Spanish model of colonial cities, characterized by a central plaza surrounding administrative buildings, a cathedral, and a grid-like street pattern, was replicated across the empire. Today, countless Latin American cities still follow this layout. The Plaza Mayor remains a central gathering place for political protests, religious festivals, and public celebrations. Architectural styles, too, reveal colonial influence. Baroque churches, neoclassical government buildings, and ornate colonial mansions reflect a blending of European aesthetics with local materials and labor. In some regions, especially in Mexico and Peru, indigenous artisans left their mark on religious and civic architecture, creating hybrid styles that express both resistance and adaptation. The legacy of the Spanish Empire is also found in literature, philosophy, and education. The colonial period produced a rich body of writing, including chronicles, sermons, poetry, and legal treatises. Post-independence writers often engaged with this legacy critically, using the Spanish language and European literary forms to express national identity, social critique, and historical memory. Figures such as Simón Bolívar and José Martí wrote passionately about the meanings of freedom, justice, and nationhood. Later authors, Gabriel García Márquez, Mario Vargas Llosa, Isabel Allende, and many others, have used Spanish-language literature to explore the legacies of colonialism, the contradictions of modernity, and the persistence of historical memory. The educational systems of former Spanish colonies were also shaped by imperial models. Universities established in colonial cities, such as the University of Santo Domingo, the University of San Marcos in Lima, and the University of Mexico, served as centers of theological, legal, and philosophical training. These institutions laid the groundwork for modern national universities, even as they evolved to reflect local priorities and social changes. The Spanish imperial legacy also resonates in matters of identity and social structure. The complex racial and caste classifications of colonial society, terms like mestizo, mulatto, criollo, and peninsular, left a lasting imprint on how societies in Latin America and the Philippines understood difference, hierarchy, and belonging. Although formal caste systems were dismantled after independence, ideas about race and social status rooted in the colonial period continued to shape politics, economics, and cultural attitudes well into the modern era. This legacy has been both enduring and contested. In the 20th and 21st centuries, indigenous movements, Afro-descendant communities, and scholars have increasingly challenged dominant narratives that glorified the Spanish conquest and downplayed its violence. New histories have emerged that center indigenous agency, expose colonial atrocities, and question the mythologies of civilizing missions. At the same time, many nations have embraced elements of the Spanish legacy as part of their national identity. Spanish language, Catholic festivals, and shared legal traditions are often celebrated alongside indigenous and African heritages in efforts to construct inclusive narratives. National holidays, symbols, and monuments reflect the complex task of balancing pride in cultural continuity with a critical understanding of colonial history. Spain itself has engaged in a similar process of reflection. After the collapse of its empire, Spain entered a period of introspection, cultural renewal, and political upheaval. Debates over the meaning of empire, its glories, failures, and moral costs have shaped Spanish literature, politics, and public memory. In recent decades, there have been official acknowledgments of historical injustices, including apologies for the expulsion of Jews in the late 15th century and critical reassessments of colonialism in school curricula and public discourse. Spain's relationships with its former colonies continue in various forms, through diplomatic ties, cultural exchange, and economic partnerships. Organizations such as the Ibero-American Summit and the Association of Spanish Language Academies reflect efforts to maintain shared linguistic and cultural connections across continents. Ultimately, the legacy of the Spanish Empire is not a single story, but a mosaic of experiences, interpretations, and identities. It is a legacy that includes both oppression and creativity, domination and adaptation, destruction and endurance. The end of Spanish political control did not erase the imprint of centuries of imperial rule. Instead, it left a foundation upon which new societies, cultures, and nations were built, shaped by the past, but always moving forward. The fall of the Spanish Empire did not simply mark the end of territorial control, it ushered in a long and often conflicted process of reflection and reinvention within Spain itself. With the loss of its colonies, Spain faced a profound identity crisis. What was the nation without its empire? What meaning could be salvaged from centuries of conquest, colonization, and global rule? These questions lingered through the 19th and 20th centuries and into the present day, shaping political ideologies, national narratives, and cultural expressions. In the immediate aftermath of empire, Spain's attention turned inward. The late 19th century was marked by economic underdevelopment, political instability, and social unrest. The trauma of the Spanish-American War, especially the dramatic losses in Cuba and the Philippines, became a symbol of national decline. The event came to be known simply as El Desastre del 98, the disaster of 98. This moment of defeat gave rise to a generation of intellectuals and writers known collectively as the Generation of 98. Figures such as Miguel de Unamuno, Azorín, Pío Baroja, and Antonio Machado grappled with the meaning of Spanish identity in the absence of empire. They explored themes of decay, regeneration, and cultural introspection. Some romanticized the simpler rural life of the Castilian heartland as the essence of Spanishness, while others critiqued the corrupt institutions and stagnant politics that had contributed to imperial collapse. These debates extended into education and literature, where empire became both a cautionary tale and a source of nostalgia. While liberal thinkers promoted reform and modernization, conservative voices looked to the imperial past for inspiration, portraying it as a golden age of unity, religious purity, and global power. The legacy of the empire was contested ground, simultaneously a symbol of greatness and a reminder of failure. In the early 20th century, Spain's internal divisions deepened. Regional nationalism, particularly in Catalonia and the Basque Country, challenged the centralist narrative that had defined Spain since the Bourbon reforms. These movements often rejected the imperial legacy altogether, seeing it as part of a broader system of Castilian domination. Meanwhile, labor unrest, class conflict, and political polarization intensified, leading to the collapse of the monarchy and the establishment of the Second Republic in the early 1930s. The Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 became another defining chapter in the reworking of national identity. The war pitted Republicans who supported democracy, secularism, and regional autonomy against nationalists, led by General Francisco Franco, who championed traditional Catholic values, military authority, and Spanish unity. For Franco and his followers, the memory of empire was a powerful rhetorical tool. The nationalists portrayed themselves as heirs to the Catholic monarchs and the imperial mission of defending religion and order. After the nationalist victory, Franco established a dictatorship that lasted until his death in the mid-1970s. Under his regime, the myth of empire was revived and institutionalized. School textbooks celebrated the glories of Spanish colonization, emphasizing the spread of Christianity, the heroism of the conquistadors, and the cultural unity of Hispanic civilization. Statues of Columbus, Cortés, and Pizarro adorned public spaces, while national holidays commemorated imperial milestones. The regime downplayed or ignored the violence, exploitation, and resistance that had characterized colonial rule. Franco's version of history served both ideological and political purposes. It bolstered nationalist sentiment, justified centralized control, and offered a sense of pride and continuity in the face of international isolation. Spain's loss of empire was reframed not as a humiliation, but as a chapter in a noble and civilizing mission that had shaped the modern world. However, not all Spaniards accepted this narrative. During Franco's rule, dissent was often suppressed, but critical voices still found ways to challenge the dominant interpretation. In literature, theater, and film, artists explored the contradictions of empire and the silences of official history. These undercurrents gained momentum after Franco's death and the transition to democracy. The democratic period that followed brought with it a more pluralistic and critical engagement with Spain's past. Scholars, educators, and cultural institutions began to re-examine the imperial legacy in light of new historiographical methods and global perspectives. Universities expanded research into colonial violence, indigenous resistance, and the experiences of marginalized groups. Public debates emerged around the meaning of conquest, the representation of empire in museums, and the place of imperial monuments in public spaces. One of the most visible signs of this shift has been the debate over national holidays and statues. October 12th, traditionally celebrated as the Día de la Hispanidad or Fiesta Nacional de España, marks the date Columbus arrived in the Americas. For some, it is a day of pride, celebrating shared language and culture across the Spanish-speaking world. For others, it is a painful reminder of colonization and its enduring injustices. In recent years, protests have erupted around the holiday, calling for its redefinition or abolition. Statues of conquistadors have also come under scrutiny. In cities such as Madrid, Seville, and Valladolid, public monuments to colonial figures have sparked debates about historical memory. Some argue that these figures should be remembered for their historical significance, while others call for their removal or contextualization, pointing to the suffering they inflicted and the ideologies they represented. Spain's engagement with its imperial past has also been shaped by its relationship with Latin America and the broader Hispanic world. While political control is gone, cultural and linguistic ties remain strong. The concept of Hispanidad, a shared cultural heritage among Spanish-speaking nations, continues to influence diplomatic, educational, and cultural exchanges. Spain has invested in programs that promote the Spanish language, fund cultural institutions, and encourage academic collaboration with Latin America. Yet these efforts exist alongside a more critical understanding of what Hispanidad means. Latin American scholars and activists have often challenged the idea that a common language and religion erase histories of exploitation and inequality. The colonial period is increasingly seen not as a shared foundation, but as a point of divergence, a moment when histories became entangled in power and resistance. The Spanish government has at times acknowledged this complexity. In recent decades, official statements have expressed regret for past abuses, such as the Inquisition and the treatment of indigenous peoples. Spain has also offered citizenship to descendants of Jews expelled in the 15th century, a symbolic gesture of reconciliation. Still, efforts to come to terms with empire remain uneven and contested. Popular culture reflects this ambivalence. Spanish films and television series have depicted the empire with a mix of nostalgia, criticism, and fascination. Historical dramas explore the lives of conquistadors, missionaries, and royal figures, often blending romance and violence. Satirical works question the myths of greatness. Museums experiment with new narratives, incorporating indigenous perspectives and highlighting the contradictions of colonization. The academic world continues to produce scholarship that deepens and complicates our understanding of the Spanish Empire. New research explores transatlantic networks, environmental impacts, gender dynamics, and the lived experiences of people at every level of colonial society. This body of work challenges simplistic portrayals and invites reflection on how empires function, collapse, and leave their marks on the world. In the broader context of world history, Spain's imperial past offers valuable lessons. It demonstrates how power can expand through military force, religious mission, and bureaucratic control, but also how it can be resisted, reshaped, and ultimately dismantled. It shows how identity is not static but constructed through memory, myth, and debate. In the 21st century, Spain faces the ongoing task of negotiating its relationship with the past. The legacy of empire is not something that can be erased or fully resolved. it is a living history, contested, layered, and deeply embedded in the national consciousness. Though the Spanish Empire formally ceased to exist more than a century ago, its global influence continues to resonate. The legacy of Spanish colonization, exploration, administration, and culture can be seen today in the daily lives, institutions, languages, and identities of people across several continents. These echoes are not confined to the pages of history books. They shape how modern nations function, how people relate to one another, and how global history is remembered, contested, and reconstructed in the 21st century. One of the most visible and far-reaching legacies is the Spanish language. Today, Spanish is the official or national language in more than 20 countries and is spoken by hundreds of millions of people. It ranks among the most spoken languages in the world by number of native speakers and continues to grow in influence due to population growth and cultural production in Spanish-speaking countries. The language is not monolithic. It exists in diverse regional varieties shaped by local histories, indigenous languages, African influence, and colonial-era institutions. In North America, Central America, and South America, Spanish continues to be the dominant language in public administration, education, and media. In the United States, Spanish is spoken by a significant portion of the population, not only as a heritage language, but also as a practical second language in many regions. Bilingual education programs, Spanish-language television networks, and growing literary and musical traditions in Spanish reflect the language's embeddedness in daily life and popular culture far beyond Spain's borders. The influence of Spanish legal and political traditions also persists in former colonial regions. Many countries in Latin America continue to use civil law systems based on the legal codes introduced during the colonial period. The principles of written law, notarial systems, and administrative bureaucracy were deeply rooted in Spanish legal culture and remain foundational to governance in countries such as Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Argentina. Similarly, patterns of urban development reflect Spanish influence. The distinctive layout of many cities in Latin America and the Philippines, centered around a main square or plaza mayor, flanked by a cathedral and government buildings, stems from the regulations imposed during the colonial period, particularly those outlined in the laws of the Indies. Even in modern megacities, these historical centers often remain symbolic and functional hubs of civic life. Religion is another powerful legacy. Catholicism, brought by Spanish missionaries and protected by colonial institutions for centuries, remains the dominant religion across much of Latin America and parts of the Philippines. While the religious landscape has diversified in recent decades, with the growth of Protestant denominations and secularization, Catholic festivals, moral frameworks, and institutional networks still play a major role in shaping culture and politics. Moreover, many national traditions and holidays in former Spanish colonies are tied to Catholic feasts, saints, or historic events rooted in the colonial period. Examples include Semana Santa, Holy Week processions in Seville, Quito, and Guatemala City, as well as patron saint festivals in towns and villages across the Hispanic world. These rituals are both religious expressions and powerful affirmations of cultural continuity. Cultural production, particularly in literature, cinema, music, and visual arts, has also been deeply shaped by the Spanish imperial legacy. Contemporary writers in Spanish-speaking countries frequently engage with themes of colonialism, identity, memory, and resistance. From the magic realism of Gabriel Garcia Marquez to the political fiction of Mario Vargas Llosa and the historical novels of Isabel Allende, authors have explored the consequences of empire in both critical and imaginative ways. In film and television, stories of conquest, rebellion, and national independence remain popular, serving as tools for reflection and education. Documentaries, dramas, and period series set in the colonial era continue to shape public understanding of the imperial past, often blending entertainment with historical reinterpretation. Another important echo of empire is the shared transatlantic identity that links Spain with Latin America, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa and Asia. This relationship is fostered by organizations such as the Ibero-American Summit and various cultural and academic institutions that promote Spanish language, literature, and history. Although the concept of Hispanidad, a shared cultural heritage, has been subject to criticism, it still provides a framework for diplomatic and educational collaboration. Yet these legacies are not without controversy. In recent decades, calls for decolonization, historical justice, and re-evaluation of the imperial past have grown louder. Scholars, activists, and indigenous groups have increasingly questioned the celebratory narratives that once defined colonial commemorations. Statues of conquistadors, names of cities and streets, and national holidays tied to the colonial era have become flashpoints for debate. In countries like Mexico, Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia, movements have emerged to reclaim indigenous languages, revive pre-Hispanic traditions, and deconstruct Eurocentric versions of history. In Spain itself, public discussion about the costs and consequences of empire has entered museums, schools, and political discourse. Questions about reparations, apologies, and historical responsibility are no longer limited to academic circles. They have become part of broader conversations about identity, justice, and collective memory. Digital technologies have further complicated and enriched these debates. Online platforms have enabled access to historical archives, facilitated transnational dialogues, and given voice to communities long excluded from mainstream histories. Educators, artists, and researchers are using podcasts, social media, and interactive exhibitions to reimagine how the Spanish Empire is remembered and taught. Another important global echo lies in migration. Patterns of movement between former colonies and Spain have intensified since the mid-20th century. Economic migration from Latin America, the Philippines, and North Africa to Spain has reshaped the country's demographics and challenged older notions of Spanish national identity. In turn, Spanish citizens have also migrated to the Americas, especially during times of economic hardship or political repression, creating new diasporic connections and communities. This transnational movement has created complex cultural exchanges. Music, food, fashion, and everyday customs often reflect the blending of Spanish, indigenous, African, and Asian influences. In cities like Miami, Mexico City, Manila, Madrid, and Buenos Aires, one can see, hear, and taste the layered history of empire in daily life, from shared vocabulary to culinary traditions rooted in colonial trade routes. Global education has also absorbed the lessons and legacies of the Spanish Empire. Universities around the world offer courses in colonial and post-colonial history, Hispanic literature, and Iberian studies. The global influence of Spanish language media, books, films, newspapers, digital journalism, contributes to the broader dissemination of ideas and debates rooted in imperial histories. Finally, international law and diplomacy have been subtly shaped by precedents set during the Spanish Empire. Early debates over sovereignty, human rights, and the legitimacy of conquest, debates led by thinkers such as Francisco de Vitoria and Bartolomé de las Casas, laid groundwork for modern principles of international ethics. Though born within a colonial context, these ideas continue to influence contemporary discussions on intervention, sovereignty, and justice. In sum, the Spanish Empire may have ended more than a century ago, but it remains present in ways both visible and invisible. It endures in language, religion, law, cityscapes, and the global imagination. Its legacies are diverse and often contradictory, at once oppressive and generative, destructive and transformative. Understanding these echoes is essential not only for grappling with the past, but also for navigating the cultural, political, and ethical complexities of the present. As we look back on the rise, expansion, administration, decline, and afterlife of the Spanish Empire, we are reminded that empires do not vanish, they evolve. They persist in stories told, systems inherited, and identities constructed. The Spanish Empire, for all its ambition and contradiction, left behind not a ruin but a living history that continues to shape the world today.